Bismillah. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining us once again. We've been having back-to-back streams. Last night, as you guys know, we had a very interesting panel with all the brothers and asking the Christian brothers to join in, and we had a very fruitful discussion yesterday. But alhamdulillah, I'm really pleased and blessed, alhamdulillah, to have a brother like Yusuf Ismail on the show today. Oh, let me just... Yeah, so guys, I do apologize for the echo. So yeah, brother Yusuf Ismail is from South Africa, studied in a university of Natal in Durban, South Africa. By profession, brother Yusuf Ismail is a lawyer. Studied international law. Also, brother Yusuf Ismail was with the IPCI, which is a very famous and profound organization. I remember in the early 70s and 80s, like Ahmadidat and other individuals in that caliber, gave and offered information and literature regarding how to debunk Christianity or the arguments for against Christianity. And also, brother Yusuf Ismail is with the South African Debate Initiative, and it's a channel on YouTube, brothers and sisters. So I recommend you, brothers and sisters, to go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel, the South African Debate Initiative. And brother Yusuf started debating or having discussions with famous or well-known Christian apologists in 2007, such as the likes of Jay Smith and others. Brother Yusuf, welcome to Cover FF, and I'm really honored and pleased to have you on the show. How is everything?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you, Brother Muhammad, for hosting me, and Brother Mustafa and the other brother. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you, esteemed brothers, that are basically sharing the information out there, and certainly we are certainly in trying times. It's depressing times. We're reaching the end. This is the 31st of December, where people will be celebrating the coming of the end of the year in sometimes gluttonous fashion. Whilst they are celebrating, people are dying by the moment as we speak in Gaza, and you see a profound, surreal situation in terms of which you get yourself involved in. If you're an empath, you would be perpetually depressed by what you see. It's shocking. It's unheard of. It's probably one of the most barbaric, shocking scenarios we've seen in modern times over the past 20 or 30 years. So the situation doesn't bode too well for our brothers in the Muslim world, and that's what we are here for, to discuss and, of course, to galvanize the public out there to take action at some level.
Yeah, thank you for that, Yusuf. Also joining us is our beloved brother Mustafa. MashaAllah, recently he's been uploading, or the channels have been uploading, some of his dawah efforts at various locations. And I just want to quickly remind, before brother Mustafa starts, that we have been kind of like touching this topic for maybe a year or so. And now we've come to this level where we've got brother Yusuf joining us and going into more depth regarding this topic, regarding Zionism. Brother Mustafa, I do recall yourself opening this can of worms. How do you feel now that from where we started and to where we are now, how do you feel the progress has been, mashallah?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to all our audience and to our esteemed guest, Brother Yusuf Ismail. And Jazakallah, Brother Muhammad, for giving us an opportunity to host this very important stream today. So, yeah, I mean, these are topics which I've touched upon on your channel going back perhaps nearly 2 years. The Zionist influence on the West in particular, and the way they seem to have the very grip, their very grip is to such an extent that people are subdued by it, from the mannerisms in which they conduct their affairs to how they essentially propel their narrative and impose it upon the masses. And we are all under a whip which is unheralded. And I've been touching upon certain points, and Brother Yusuf will today elaborate much further in regards to the events which have been taking place, particularly in Palestine, giving a great overview of the historical context in which these matters have unfolded, and we'll be looking considerably at these particular points. So, I mean, the show will be dedicated to Brother Yusuf in this regard, and then we can have perhaps a discussion once he has completed his overview, in which we can invite the audience to discuss these matters. So, yeah, I mean, this is something which is long overdue, giving a much more elongated and detailed account of the historicity of this Zionist movement and how today's world is perpetually being, supporting the atrocities which have been taking place in Palestine, and which is all very visible. And as Brother Yusuf so correctly mentioned, whilst this year now comes to or draws to an end, people are celebrating whilst people are dying. I mean, the paradox in history is savage, to say the least. So we really want to delve into this topic, and we are privileged to have Brother Yusuf to elaborate on those points.
Yeah, Brother Yusuf, one thing here in the West, especially living in the UK, unfortunately, the people, the mass population seem to understand that this conflict started on the 7th of October. But with your studies and your research, when did this conflict actually start, and how did it come to pass? Or how did it initially trigger the whole, situation that we are currently right now in?
Yeah, thanks, Brother Muhammad and Brother Mustafa. I think that's a kind of a talking point. And, for the first time, I never watched these shows, but they've become so popular. Piers Morgan Uncensored. We never watched him before the 7th of October. Talk TV. I've now discovered that Talk TV is owned by News Corp, which is controlled by Rupert Murdoch. And that seems to be the constant talking point about 7th of October. Do you condemn Hamas? What's your take? So it basically, in a sense, it puts you in the automatic position of defense. And even some of the Muslim brothers out there who come out and, in fact, condemn Hamas. I understand that Hamas is proscribed in the United Kingdom as a supposed terrorist organization. The hypocrisy of the entire situation, in light of the fact that your government, the UK government, has been responsible for some of the worst atrocities, in the world. I think your own politician, George Galloway, once, when questioned, pointed out that your government under Blair killed 1 million people in Iraq. So it's a height of cynicism that this nation prescribes another organization as a terrorist organization, notwithstanding the fact that in the 80s, it also designated the ANC and Nelson Mandela under the Thatcherite regime as terrorist outfits. So this is basically the sense of the duplicity, the double standards, and the hypocrisy. And unfortunately, when we fall into the trap of believing that history began on the 7th of October, or we buy directly into the narrative of condemnation, we automatically basically put ourselves in the back foot. So, coming to the root of the question, where did this begin? Where did this start? And I think Brother Mustafa and yourself, from what you've informed me, have gone into detail with this. But the actual, Zionist movement, at least, and I'm kind of ridding it of its so-called religious undertones, but the actual modern Zionist movement was founded or formed by one individual, Theodor Herzl, who was by no means a religiously minded Jew. He was secular, and he wrote a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. I think it was sometime in the 1890s. And the whole aim of that was to envision the founding of a future independent Jewish state during the 20th century. That was the entire thrust of it. The thrust was basically, let's create this homeland for Jewish people in Palestine, or wherever the area is. And, it essentially emerged, I may add, as a result of the rising forms of anti-Semitism. And I'm saying anti-Semitism in a particular context because we're talking about European hatred towards other white Jew people who were designating or calling themselves Jews, because these were white people. These were white European individuals, and they were subjected to persecution based, of course, on their purported affiliation towards Judaism or something that was basically viewed as strange. And so from the 1890s right up going to the 1940s, the whole aim or the goal of the Zionist movement was to basically establish homeland. Now, I may add, and I read this somewhere, I think it's in this book, which I would highly recommend to your viewers to get. A fantastic book by Sami Hadawi, who was basically a Palestinian scholar who lived in Jerusalem in 1904, and he worked as an official land valuer during the British Mandate in the period of Palestine. He made the point that initially when Zionism or when the Zionist movement were calling for the establishment of a Jewish homeland, they had different places in mind. They, for example, and I was quite surprised to note that they had a country called Uganda in Africa as a possible potential Jewish homeland. They had a certain aspects, in Argentina. This was obviously before the Balkanization process, so you didn't have kind of nation states that had been essentially formed. And so these were alternatives that they were looking at. They were looking at Latin America, South America, parts of Africa. And so it was not a kind of a foregone conclusion that the land Palestine, or what was then basically under the Ottoman control, was going to be eventually what basically became Israel. Although that would have been the likely outcome or the determination by these individuals. But they looked at various alternatives. And so eventually, through a series of recommendations made by them, a large number of Jewish people, they immigrated first to the Ottoman region, which was then under Ottoman control, and later, after the First World War, under what then became known as the mandatory Palestine, or the Palestinian Mandate, which was then under a colonial occupation. And subsequently, you basically find a situation that after Israel was bombed into existence, and I must put this point here, bombed into existence, it continued primarily to advocate on behalf of Israel that Zionism as an ideology continues to advocate on behalf of Israel and to obviously address the threats to its continued so-called existence and its so-called right to self-defense, which you're hearing all the time. Now, I may add this point that when the partition took place, and you will probably know, the land that was apportioned to what was going to become Jewish land was, I think, something like 57%, and the Palestinian control partition was about 42%. And so the argument that is generally put forth out there is that, well, Palestinians never accepted this. But the reality of the situation is that when Israel was eventually bombed into existence, it basically took something like 70%, 75% of the particular land. So it took more of the land than what was initially apportioned to it. The other argument, and we may probably go into this in detail, hopefully the conversation goes forth, is that the argument that is presented out there that basically Israel was a kind of a benign entity. These were benign Jewish communities. And suddenly you had a situation where Arabs and the Arab armies invaded and attacked them. Nothing could be further from the truth, because leading up to the existence of the state of Israel, which was bombed into existence, you had a series of massacres and terrorist attacks by Jewish terrorist outfits, which were euphemistically described as Jewish militia outfits. And you know the names like Irgun and Stern, which were subcategories of the Haganah. And they were involved in some of the most horrendous, vicious, brutal massacres that you could ever believe in. I mean, you look at, you can't even, we don't even have the time to go into the list of the massacres that basically took place. But there were, for example, the famous massacre that people normally talk about, the Deir Yassin massacre, where you have a situation that Palestinian women were systematically gang raped by Jewish terrorist outfits. They were gang raped. You had, for example, a situation in terms of which they raped the women, they lined up the men, and they shot them dead in cold blood. And some of the individuals that were leading these outfits were individuals that became the founding fathers of Israel, like Menachem Begin and David Ben Gurion. It's quite ironical that when Rishi Sunak, when he went, I think, to Israel just I think a couple of months back, and we saw, I don't know if you probably saw on the press or whether it was in fact shown in London, but we saw the images about him coming out of an aircraft and in fact giving the Israeli ambassador to the UK with arms and ammunition. We saw this out there at the height of the genocide that was basically taking place. He, in fact, stayed, and I believe he stayed not too far away from the King David Hotel, which was subjected to bombing and destruction by these Israeli terrorist death squads, where I think you had, for example, British soldiers, British military outfits that were massacred. And there's been no apology to date, And it's quite ironical that when the Prime Minister went there and staying not too far, I believe, nearby the King David Hotel, that there's not a qualm, not a whimper made about what had happened. So the reality of the situation, that the formation of the State of Israel was bloody. This was from the early 1940s, at least 1945, right up till 1947, when it was bombed into existence. And even before that, in the 30s, you had these sporadic killings that were being conducted by these Jewish terrorist squads, which people should know and which people should acknowledge and which people should realize which laid the basis for the foundation of any hostility that may have existed, that was basically that may have manifested by the Arab regimes that were around that particular area. So basically what had happened in 1948, then Israel was bombed into existence. They created a massive refugee crisis. We know close to 1 million Palestinians were left, and they became essentially refugees, and they were never allowed to remain in that particular area. Those Palestinians that eventually stayed there, David Ben Gurion, I think, made a statement that at a much later time in history that he wished he could have got rid of them as well. And then subsequently, what had happened after 1948, you had the Gaza Strip, which was under Egyptian control, and then you had the West Bank, which was under Jordanian control. But come 1967, Israel then invaded those particular territories. Subsequently, up until the 80s, that's 88, Gaza was basically still under occupation. In 1990, you had the Oslo Accords, and eventually you had the so-called removal of these particular Israeli armed officials in 2005, where the settlers were removed, where there were, I may add, just simply a superficial legislative election, because Hamas was not in control of anything, but the people basically voted for Hamas in light of the corruption that was existing in the Palestinian Authority, and people believed that the Palestinian Authority had sold out. And after Hamas had gone into legislative control, what then happened was that you had a total blockade, which totally devastated the Gaza economy and caused about approximately 50% of the poverty rate and probably one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Now, we make this point before I end this particular portion, that there were these rocket attacks. I may point this out, that these rockets that were so-called flying into Israel from Hamas have no airheads. They've caused absolutely, I think from 2006 to 2023, that's up until the 7th of October, up to, I think, about 39 casualties. And I may add that the rockets were only fired by Hamas after there was a raid by Israel in 2006 in the Gaza Strip, after Hamas had won the legislative election, and after there was an airstrike. And so then you had these rocket attacks which were fired by Hamas, and then it subsequently led to Operation Castle in 2009, and of course Operation Pill of Defense, I think, in 2014. So in 2009, 2012, 2014, and now, of course, 2019. And then you had the situation in the Sheikh Jarrah area, I think, in 2021, where Israeli settlers stormed and they removed Palestinians from this particular area. But the problem is, what has happened is that since 2006, right up until this particular point in time, Gaza has been under siege. And I've seen some of the comments which are being made in some of the British media, like Talk TV and I think Sky News Australia, for that particular matter, that Gaza could be a potential Singapore. What absolute hogwash! What rubbish! I mean, look at the situation in Gaza. Prior to the 7th of October, 96% of the water was undrinkable. Gazans in general had about 4 to 5 hours of electricity per day. They had 45% unemployment. You had 46% of the kids that suffer anemia. 50% of the children had depression, and 2 million of the people who were denied the actual freedom to live. So when you have a situation that they claim that this could be potentially Singapore, what the reality of the situation was that Israel supplied, and they stopped and they started, but they controlled the supply of water, electricity, fuel, and in relation to the ports itself, that's not under control of Gazans at all. So if you contrast that to, for example, a nation like Singapore with an extremely highly developed market economy, most of the GDP that has been generated or coming out of Singapore is basically historically based on the extended trade at the ports, what they call the entrepot trade. So along with Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, the so-called four Asian tigers, the gross domestic product since 1965 right up until now has averaged there's been growth rates averaging approximately 6% per annum. So it's absolute nonsense when you say that, look, we've left Gaza on its own. So Gaza, we are now living under perpetual threat. Instead of basically developing the economy, Hamas has basically engaged in building up these particular tunnels. The reality of the situation is Hamas was not, and has never ever been for the past decade and a half an existential threat to Israel. Not at all. It has never been, with the exception of what happened on the 7th of October. And we'll, of course, explore the dynamics about what really happened. But Hamas has never been a threat whatsoever to Israel. The reality of the situation, I mean, even the items of the goods, there's a policy which Israel has that it measures the number of people in Gaza, and it basically mentions, or it basically suggests that Gaza has to be a portion that each individual has to be given a certain number of calories per day, which is beyond the basic minimum calories that you could have. So therefore, not surprisingly, a lot of commentators have described this as a mass open prison. But in reality, it's not a mass open prison, because in a prison, you basically have food, you have water, you have the basic decent sanitation. These Gazans don't even have basic decent sanitation when 90% of the water is undrinkable. So how on earth could you call it a prison in the first place? It's an open concentration camp. A prison is not bombed. A prison is not sporadically having a situation where Israeli soldiers run in and rush in and perpetually go and shoot people randomly or engage in raids. The control is purely superficial from the perspective of Hamas, and therefore, not surprisingly, what you've got, or what happened on the 7th of October, is simply symptomatic of a far larger problem, which quite conveniently the mainstream media is hiding and, of course, not basically showing. But I'm optimistic because for the first time ever, I see, which you've never seen in the past and you could never see 20 years ago, where outfits like, for example, Sky News and BBC and CNN are asking questions that they would not ordinarily have asked. I mean, I see there was an interview which was conducted, I believe, on Sky News by one of your journalists, where he was questioning Mark Regev, or it was the other nutcase, Elon Levi, on the issue of the shooting of the massacre at the Maghazi camp that just took place on Christmas Eve. And I saw the questions that were asked, which was surprising to me, because in the past, mainstream journalists in the United Kingdom and in the US would never ask these particular questions, albeit they are somewhat subdued. But the point is, these questions are now being asked. And I believe at some level, Israel is in fact losing the propaganda war. Social media and certainly podcasts like you brothers and others out there are changing the game. You're changing what's happening, and the lies that we've been subjected to for a number of years, for decades rather, that's slowly being waved away, it's been eked away. And so people are basically seeing that we are no longer being subjected to the kind of propagandas and lies. And we've got a new generation. The younger generation have access to social media. They've got access to TikTok in real time. And of course, you see these images before your eyes. You see images of beheaded babies, but they're not Israeli babies, they're Palestinian babies. You see images of burnt children and burnt people, but they're not burnt children or burnt people from the 7th of October. They are burnt Palestinians in real time before our eyes. So it becomes difficult. It becomes difficult for Israel or its propagandists out there to, in fact, construct an argument. And so it's just a kind of a threefold argument that they invent. They either say, number one, that they've got no choice for the deaths because these people are human shields, albeit the Palestinians, which is a racist analogy, that they are human shields. Or number two, that what basically happened was essentially a mistake, as they claimed in the Maghazi camp, the refugee camp last week, where they claimed that the incorrect munitions were used. Well, what munitions were used, for example, at the Jabalia refugee camp, when close to 100 people were killed to target one Hamas person? Was it not a mistake then? Or alternatively, the third alternative is that they're saying that they are acting under self-defense. So the lies and the propagandist hogwash is falling away before our eyes. And nobody takes us seriously anymore. No decent person with common sense can basically take this seriously. And I think we need to be far more emboldened. I do understand that there are limitations and restrictions on the brothers in terms of movements like Hamas, but in South Africa, we basically, our South African government met with Hamas. We met with Hamas leadership just a couple of weeks back. So I understand that there's a dilemma in terms of what people can say or cannot say in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom. But at the very least, we need to conscientize people in terms of breaking the shackles of the propaganda that has been enclosing their eyes for a number of years. And I think I can see that is happening slowly, albeit at a slow pace, but it's happening. And people are no longer buying into this kind of propagandist lie and racist stereotypes that are before our eyes.
Yeah, subhanallah. That's very powerful, brother Yusuf. Mustafa, anything that you want to add or share?
Yeah, mashallah, you gave a historical account of the events that have been leading up to what we have been witnessing over the last couple of months, tragic events which have unfolded. Mashallah, brother gave a thorough account, as I made mention, on these particular events, address the historical context and the setting, which is often overlooked, you see, in this situation. Many people are of the opinion that these events started on 7th of October by the supposed attack by Hamas on the camp where the Israeli IDF, I think, were congregating. But this has been shown to be a complete fallacy. The historical context is absolutely prevalent and understanding the situation which has developed historically and the brutality in which this Zionist movement has neutralized and brutalized the Palestinian people over a 75-year period. It's now coming to light. The great thing about these platforms that we particularly have, although they're not huge in number, it gives the people an opportunity to really reflect and understand the historical context of these events that have occurred. And we're now seeing, as Brother Yusuf has made mention, a new generation coming forward who are not prepared to tolerate the tragedies of the past, and they really want to make a difference. And whilst we have these opportunities to learn the events that have occurred historically, it gives us the moral high ground, essentially, to really propagate the truthful reality of the brutal occupation of the Palestinian people over this 75-year period. So we've had a thorough account of that in a minimized.
I just want to mention something else, Mustafa, just on that point, is that when I see Mark Regev, and he's been interviewed by Piers Morgan regularly, and I think it was Brother Hamza or somebody that described Piers as an algorithm prostitute, which in fact he is, because of the fact that it's a kind of a clickbait for a lot of these mainstream media. But the one thing that comes out is the idea that is put forth that and people don't know, I don't know, you brothers would know, but people don't know that the argument is that the IDF is inherently a moral army. The IDF does not target civilians at all. The IDF, if civilians are, of course, killed, then this is probably, and they use the offensive term, collateral damage. But the one thing that should come out is that the IDF, or the forerunners to the IDF, is that the IDF per se, the Israeli Defense Force, which is a terrorist outfit, was formed on the basis of sanguinary mass murder and warfare. I mean, if you look at these what they call the revisionist Zionist paramilitaries, the terrorist groups like Irgun and the Stern Gang, which were the I think subsidiaries of the Haganah gang, because the Haganah also had other subsidiaries like the Palmach. If you look at these Jewish terrorist outfits that were the forerunners to the IDF, because they basically became the IDF after 1948. The massacres that they committed started before the Second World War. So the general argument that is basically being presented is that Jews, or the Jewish community, were a very benevolent community, and they were subjected to persecution, which of course at one level it is clear, not just Jews, but other groups like the Roma community, the Gypsies, the Polish, and various other communities in Eastern Europe. But the idea is that this was a benevolent entity that was subjected to persecution, that was starving, and so they came as victims, as peaceful victims in this land, and then they were attacked by the Arab armies, and then eventually you had this declaration in 48. But the reality is, if you look at the Jerusalem massacre was committed by the Irgun terrorist Zionist entity. That was in 1937. That was before the Second World War, in fact, commenced. So my question is, what were these Jewish terrorist outfits doing in Jerusalem under Palestinian mandate and under the British mandate in 1937? The Haifa massacre, where the paramilitaries from both Irgun and the Lehi Zionist groups, they bombed the entire market of Haifa. They killed, I think, about 20 Palestinians. Or the subsequent Jerusalem massacres and the subsequent Haifa massacres. I mean, these were repeated massacres in 1937, 1938, close to about 20 massacres where people were shot dead. These were civilians being killed. Hand grenades were thrown in at Palestinians at the vegetable market. These killings, these death squads, were already in operation long before the Second World War had commenced. So this belies the whole notion that essentially Zionism was a peaceful project that just simply wanted to establish a homeland for Jews that were subjected to persecution. The Zionist terrorist outfits were already in progress in the 1930s, causing havoc and mayhem. And I mean, British soldiers, for example, British soldiers were killed. British outfits were killed. Like, for example, I mentioned in the 40s at King David Hotel. So this is a lie that needs to be broken. And also, I think the fact that even after 1948, you had, for example, there's one massacre which was, I think, just declassified. Brother, if you can go to your email, I think I may have emailed what is called the Kafr Qassam massacre. That was a massacre that that happened, I think, in 1956. And what happened with that particular massacre, if we don't have it, I'll just basically go through it. What essentially happened was that the Jews, the Israeli civilian defense force, these particular individuals, they were given the free run to simply go and massacre the entire population. If you go on Google, just simply do a Google search, and you'll open up what is called the Kafr Qasim massacre. And I'll just open it. You can do a Wikipedia search on it. It's basically, it took place in a village in Kafr Qasim. It was declassified, I think, in 2021, where the massacre there was a joint list in the Knesset to officially recognize that this was indeed a massacre. What had happened was that Israeli border police, they came across these Arab civilians that were returning from work during a curfew. They were unaware of this particular curfew. That curfew had been imposed, prior to the 1956 war, on the eve of the Sinai War. And in total, you had a situation of 48 people were shot dead in cold blood. 19 were men, 6 were women, 23 were children aged 8 to 17. And the Arab sources, on the other hand, give this figure up to as high as 50. This was in cold blood, shot dead in cold blood. There was no Hamas there. There was no Islamic Jihad. There was no Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The border police who were involved in the shooting, they were eventually brought to trial, but the Israeli court that found that they were basically operating under command responsibility. In other words, they were given the direct order by the highest ranking officials to commit these particular massacres. So that's one out of a number of massacres. There's been so many massacres that have happened from 1948 onwards that people have even lost count in relation to what has basically happened. And people assume, therefore, that whenever Israel bombs and whenever Israel kills civilians, this is out of necessity, this is collateral damage. Israel doesn't really mean this. But the reality of the situation is that Israel has had a history. It's got a precedent of doing it before the formation of the State of Israel, during the formation of Israel when it was bombed into existence in 48, and from 1948 up until this present date, where they are killed deliberately, with deliberate intent. So it's the biggest lie that we are essentially seeing. It's only in 2007, I may add, that in relation to the massacre at Kafr Qasim, where Shimon Peres formally apologized for the particular massacre, which was an anathema. It was basically it's something that is unheard of, because Israel never apologizes for any of its massacres. So Israel is a state that was created on the basis of an ideological premise in terms of promoting itself through genocide. It was bombed into existence through genocide and ethnic cleansing. It sustained itself for the past 75 years through genocide and ethnic cleansing. And what is engaged now is just simply taking it on a new level of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And October 7th was the so-called weapon of mass destruction. So-called weapon of mass destruction, like you had the UK and the US government having the weapon of mass destruction in Iraq as a kind of a pretext to destroy and butcher the Iraqis. So Israel basically needed something for what it always intended to do, and October 7th was a convenient excuse, allowing it to engage in its kind of sanguinary mass insanity that you see before our very eyes. And I think we should not keep quiet about this. We should drum it all the time, because every time I see some of our good Muslim brothers in the media, they're on the back foot. What happened on October 7th? Do you condemn Hamas? What about the Hamas Charter? Well, let's look at the Hamas Charter. Let's read it. Let's go and see what they actually mean and what they say. And so we need to basically make this discourse available in the public eye, and of course, shame them for the fact that they do not have the decency, or they have got no moral qualms in terms of questioning us when they themselves are justifying and sustaining a genocidal state.
That's amazing. Wallahi, it's really profound the way you gave out the information. I've got a very sensitive or controversial question. When these so-called Israeli politicians or leaders, do they feel that they are religiously bound to kind of like get rid of the Palestinians and take over that land, or are they using it, or they're using monetary or financial gains? Which one is it?
You know, it's quite strange that a lot of these Israelis themselves, these Israeli leaders, the members of the parliament, I mean, there's different factions. For example, there's an interesting book. I don't know. I'll probably kind of send the email. It's written by a local South African called Why Israel: The Anatomy of a Zionist Apartheid, a South African Perspective. And he goes into details with the different parties that make up the particular Knesset. And by and large, what he argues in this particular book in relation to the political setup in Israel and the political, the kind of ideological leanings of a lot of these politicians themselves, a lot of them are secular. There are very few that are basically, for example, he gives you a list of parties, and of course, a lot of these parties, for example, like he gives you a summary of the primary political parties in Israel. And, you know, you've got the Kadima, the Likud party, the Labour party, the Yisrael Beitenu, the Shas party, the Mafdal party. The only party that is kind of religiously minded, which you probably know, is the Shas party, because that's the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party. And one of the famous leaders was Rabbi Ovedia Yusuf. If you look at the other parties, for example, like Labour Party, which has been traditionally leftist, although equally genocidal in its basic the way it postulates itself, the way it has perpetuated itself over the years. If you look at some of the people under Likud, people like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, these are not individuals that were peace-loving individuals, but they were secular nonetheless. And then, of course, you've got the Likud party, which is the Menachem Begin, Shamir Netanyahu, and then Kadima, which is Sharon. From what I can gather, a lot of these individuals are not religiously minded. They are secular. But when it suits them and when it's convenient for them, they make the argument that that justifies their existence based on religious grounds. I mean, Theodor Herzl himself and a lot of the individuals that were part and parcel of the early Zionist classical movement were by no means religious. Chaim Weizmann, for example, none of these individuals. And by the way, the late scholar, the brilliant scholar Muhammad Asad, when he was, I may just share this, when he was a correspondent for the Austrian-German newspaper, the Frankfurter Zeitung, he in fact narrates in his book, I believe it's either The Road to Mecca or Islam at the Crossroads, that he was at one of these meetings. He was actually covering one of the meetings. Muhammad Asad, by the way, is Leopold Weiss is Muhammad Asad, the famous translator of one of the best Qurans in the 20th century, the translation. But he was at this particular meeting, and he was with Weizmann, and he was with a lot of these Zionist leaders in the early 1920s. And he makes a point that none of them were particularly religiously minded. They were by no means ultra-Orthodox in that sense, but conveniently they used religion as a basis for justifying the particular existence of the state of Israel. And of course, I mean, they appealed to the whole ancient argument that Israel basically was belonging to the Jews. Israel, in fact, was something which was controlled by them at some particular point in ancient history, and so from that particular perspective, they've got some sort of allegiance to the state of Israel, and so this is their homeland. But the reality of the situation, which people also don't know, is that Palestine has never been under Jewish autonomy, at least up till from 1948. From 1948, it had never been under Jewish autonomy for close to 4,000 years. What I mean by that, if you look at the periods that existed in ancient history, for example, even from the time of David, and archaeologically we cannot prove it, but from 1000 BC, from about 1000 BC approximately, it was under Persian rule. I think from about 538 to 300 BC, it was then under Hellenistic rule, from 300 BC onwards. Subsequently, in the period of 100 BC onwards, going downwards, it becomes under Roman rule. You had the early Roman period, the late Roman period. You then had the Byzantine period, and then in the 6th or 7th century, you have the Arabs. So Jews had never been under or Palestine had never been under Jewish autonomy for at least close to 3,000 to 4,000 years, at the very least. And those Jews who basically came or claimed the so-called autonomy of this particular land based on the so-called allusion to the idea of the ancient Israelites being under occupation at some particular point in time and being under so-called political and religious control. If we were to grant that for the sake of argument, the Jews who basically make that particular claim have no linguistic, they've got no genetic, nor do they have any kind of religious link or affiliation with the ancient Israelites. I mean, most of the Jews, I believe it was Shlomo Sand in his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, and of course, I think the same point was made by Arthur Koestler in his book, The 13th Tribe, that a lot of the Jews from Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Central Europe, come from, they were actually descendants of Jews who had apparently converted to Judaism in the 7th or 8th century, and they come from Eastern Europe. That's why they call them the kind of Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazi, that's a kind of a term that was used to define a distinct kind of cultural group of Jews who settled in the 10th century in Western Germany. They were converts to Judaism. They were not indigenous to Judaism. Jews who were indigenous to the Palestinian area, or the area which is now Israel, lived side by side with the Palestinians for thousands of years under Ottoman control, and before that under the time of the Abbasids and the Umayyad period. So they've got no linguistic claims. So coming to your initial question, I know we've gone in a roundabout way. A lot of these politicians are by no means religiously minded. They're not religiously minded at any level whatsoever, but they use religion as a basis for justifying their particular mass actions of genocide and genocide. And I may make one particular point. The one thing that comes out all the time is that doesn't Israel have the right to defend itself? And these people are under siege, they being killed. Don't they have the right to defend themselves? But it's quite amazing that whilst the mainstream media are making this particular point, the very leaders in the Knesset, who are basically in control of Israel, who are by no means religious, are not actually raising self-defense. So, for example, when Netanyahu says, we will turn Gaza into an island of ruins, and he invokes the Amalekite massacre in accordance with 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, he's not speaking as a religious Jew, although he claimed to be religious. He's secular, but he invokes that as a basis for justifying genocide. When the Israeli extremist, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, speaks about killing of Palestinians and Gazans because they're animals, and he made it clear when Yoav Gallant stated that there will be no food, no water, no electricity because we are dealing with human animals and cockroaches, and they use language that is being used, that was used basically in the Rwandan genocide. We clearly know that on the one hand, they're using religion as a basis for political expediency, particularly when Netanyahu invokes the Amalekite massacre. And number two, they give the intent to commit war crimes and genocide and destruction and massacre. So when Piers Morgan hypocritically states that, look, I only concern myself, I've got a moral quandary here about the fact that what is the proportionality of Israel's right to self-defense? There's no proportionality. They're not talking about proportionality. When one of the reservists, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, who tells Israeli Arabs that the only reason that they are here is because Israel did not finish the job in 1948. They give the intent to commit war crimes and genocide and destruction and massacre, like the minister who spoke about nuking Gaza. Or, so the point is, how many Palestinian babies need to be slaughtered, how many families need to be incinerated due to Israel's carpet bombing for it to be contingent to Israel's so-called hypocritical claim to self-defense. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. So they use religion when it suits them, and of course, when it's expedient, they claim land. But in reality, most of them are not basically Jewish from a religious point of view. I mean, you look at the social element in Israel. The largest gay pride parade festival, openly allowed. I believe, subject to correction, it is in Israel. If you look at, for example, a lot of these practices that are committed by Israel, I mean, they're not religiously minded, but when it comes to land, when it comes to property, when it comes to control, they use religion as a basis for political expediency. So that would be my take and response to your question, Brother Muhammad, on that particular issue. And it's quite clear that these people are out on their insane quest for total destruction, and they want the land of Gaza for their own claim.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Brother Yusuf. I think social media plays a huge part in this war or this conflict that's taking place right now. Initially, on the 7th of October, Hamas was blamed for beheading babies and raping and whatnot. And then it kind of turned out throughout eyewitnesses that a lot of the killing was done by the IDF. The helicopters that were used, they actually killed more civilians, Israelis, than Hamas or the attack that actually took place. How do you feel? You touched on it slightly regarding the media and how much the media has kind of swayed towards empathy and sympathizing from the Palestinian side. This rule of not taking hostages and the killing of Israelis at the so-called party, how do you feel right now that the media has kind of like sometimes sweeps information underneath the carpet? And do you feel right now that the story or the narrative is being delivered equally now? The attack that we saw, the images of the road, and you saw cars burnt out, and from basic information and knowledge, you can tell that is done by military, helicopters, aircraft being used to attack and even kill hostages. What is your understanding of this type of rule that the Israelis use and the IDF rules that, no hostages are allowed to be taken? There is a terminology for that.
Yeah, there's a terminology. It's called the what's it called? It's a terminology where hostages are basically killed. It just slips my mind, but I'll come to it closely. I'll come to it shortly. Some doctrine, the Hannibal doctrine. The Hannibal doctrine. Yeah, the Hannibal doctrine was actually used. They claim it was basically done away with, and it basically applies to what they call Israeli military officials. The thrust of the Hannibal doctrine is the following: is that if, for example, you see, it's a directive, it's a procedure that, and they claim that they've done away with it. What normally happens is that where there's a kidnapping of, say, a military official, a military or a soldier for that particular matter, then that kidnapping must be stopped at all means, even if it means that you strike and you harm the person or you kill the person with your own force. I think this doctrine first came out in the 80s. I think it was the mid-80s, because what had happened then, if you look at 82, before that, there was the Lebanon, the invasion of Lebanon in 82, where, again, Israel committed massacres of untold proportions. And you are probably familiar with the Sabra and Shatila massacres, of where in a period of 2 days, close to 3,000 Palestinians were butchered and killed by phalangists. And this was overseen by the Israeli Defense Force that had secured the area and allowed these Lebanese phalangists and these Christian phalangists to just simply massacre these Palestinians. What had happened was, in 86, there were a number of abductions by IDF of soldiers in Lebanon, and there were the so-called these so-called prisoner exchanges, in terms of which we get your soldiers and then we bargain and negotiate. And I think it had to do with, I believe, the forces that were fighting the Israelis back then. I think it was Hezbollah. What then happened is that they introduced this directive, and this directive stated, the Hannibal Directive, that if you can't stop this kidnapping because it'll put you in a state of disadvantage, then you ensure that the kidnapper and the person who is kidnapped must be killed. So this basic process has gone on from time immemorial from that particular period. They claimed that the IDF chief of staff in 2016 had apparently revoked it. And this was basically, I think, it was in relation to the chap that was kidnapped, the individual, what's his name, Gilad Shalit, I think sometime around 2016. And then they claimed that this directive had been done away with. But it's quite clear that if you look at the facts on the particular ground that happened on the 7th of October, what we see out playing in real time appears to be something like the Hannibal Directive. Because a number of people that were kidnapped on that day or taken as hostages were members of the Israeli Defense Force together with Israeli civilians. So it's not untoward to believe that Israel, this is a so-called unique situation, and that Israel would have particularly invoked this specific doctrine in order to prevent the idea that hostages are taken, and then it puts Israel on a back foot, in terms of which it would be forced to now negotiate about the thousands of Palestinians that are kept under illegal administrative detention on the West Bank, and certainly languishing in the torture cells of Israel. So what initially happened on December, October, we were told that 2,000 people were killed. This was the figures that we were at least hearing in South Africa, at least on the news that we were getting on Associated Press and Reuters. The figures were then basically reduced after about, I think, a week to 1,200. And then that was being trumped out that, look, 1,400 people were being killed over and above the number of civilians that were taken in captivity. And then we were also told about the fact that babies were beheaded, 40 beheaded babies, and that women were basically raped, and that women were sexually violated. All of that could be traced to one particular journalist. And in fact, at that time, I think CNN, or it was captured on news, that CNN officials were even told, the CNN journalists were told to simulate, for example, that they're being attacked by Hamas and by Israel at the early stages of this particular conflict. We then got to realize that the beheaded babies story was totally fabricated. Joe Biden, who initially parroted this rubbish, had to do a about turn because there was no eyewitness testimony for that. And further, there was no eyewitness testimony, and there has never been an eyewitness testimony of rape that took place up to this day. Nobody has come out. Those hostages or those civilians that were released by Hamas, in fact, give a very positive account on their treatment by Hamas when they were kept in custody. In fact, they mentioned, the elderly lady, I think the 87-year-old lady, stated that she was under fear of the Israeli bombings of Gaza at that particular point in time. Because Israel's bombing, we can make the argument whether it's indiscriminate or discriminate, but they were in fear of the fact that they would be killed, these hostages, which just goes to show that Israel cares dilly squat about these hostages. But be that as it may, the so-called mass rape was done away with. The electronic intifada, for example, goes into a lengthy detail in terms of how this particular story is garbage, and that the actual crime that is alleged to have stated to have occurred never took place. Eventually, once all this garbage was put aside, and by the time that people realized that this was false and this information was correct, there were no beheaded babies, no beheaded children. We haven't even seen a single image of a beheaded person. I've seen clips of the 43 minutes. There were no beheaded babies or raped children. But once that was already debunked, Israel had already began its insane attack on Gaza. And I think we had, at that stage, close to 5,000 people had already been killed and been murdered. Eventually, in November 2023, MSNBC, which was led by the excellent journalist Mahdi Hassan, I believe he was removed after the show. I'm not so sure if he's back again doing his program, but he challenged the Israeli spokesperson, this propagandist that I've spoken about, Mark Regev, about the many lies and the claims that Israel had made to justify its genocidal bombing. And when he was attempting to respond to that particular question, he was trying to shift and change the narrative. Eventually, he made one admission. And his admission was this. He stated that originally, they made the claim that Hamas had come in and burnt everybody. And so they had given the casualty figure to 1,400, including the bodies that were burnt allegedly by Hamas. He made the admission on television that out of the 1,400 casualties, Israel has now officially reduced the figure to 1,200 because they claim that they've overestimated and made the mistake. And they are not. He made the claim. This can be seen if you open up the link that I've sent to the brother from the Electronic Intifada. You can see the video. He makes the point that the bodies that they thought that they were burnt were actually Hamas terrorists. This is his own words. They were burnt, and they were burned by Hamas terrorists, and it actually, we had burnt them. In other words, this is exactly what he says. So if he burnt them, and you see pictures of burning and the houses being burnt, and there was an entire convoy of motor vehicles that were totally burnt out and destroyed, and they looked like they had been struck, it's quite clear that who burned them? Who burned them? It's quite clear that Israel burned them. And now we are told that Israeli Apache helicopters basically came in and attacked Hamas. But in the process of burning Hamas, what they failed to realize that there were other burned bodies there, and those burned bodies were in all likelihood burned by Israel. This is confirmed by Mark Regev in his interview with Mahdi Hassan. And so he's caught out on that particular point because the burned bodies were always used as an excuse to commit the genocide in Gaza. And they were basically pointed out. In fact, this one of your own guys, what's his name, from the Henry Jackson Society, Douglas Murray. He went on at the initial stages, and he's sent in as an embedded journalist to Tel Aviv, and I see him sitting in Tel Aviv, and he claims to be in a war zone like a hypocrite. That he's seen these burned bodies. He's seen all these burned bodies in the hospitals. He's witnessed the burned bodies, and it is atrocious. Which burned bodies did he see? When Mark Regev, who is the propagandist for Israel, conceded on live television on MSNBC that the burned bodies were Hamas burned bodies, and he says that they made a mistake. But if they are burned Hamas bodies, what about the other burned houses? What about the burned cars? What about the civilians who burned them? Now Israel hasn't mentioned anything along that line. So as it stands right now, the actual figures are something like 1,139 in total. Out of the 1,139, approximately 420 were apparently Israeli soldiers. And even though it claimed that it had direct evidence, if you look at the 43-minute video that they showed a selected group of audience, I don't know if you've seen those 43 minutes. I think it could be downloaded from the dark web, but there's no image of Hamas burning anyone, nothing at all. There's no image of Hamas beheading anybody, no image of Hamas beheading babies, no image of Hamas raping anyone. Yes, you do see people getting killed and people being taken away, but Israel up to this date has never been able to explain how on earth these fighters, if it was Hamas as they initially did, could cause such an enormous amount of damage to the Israeli houses if they only had light weapons that they were seen carrying, because they came in these hang gliders. And obviously, the Hamas fires, the Hamas organization, the members, they didn't set themselves on fire. And Israel obviously got to know the circumstances in terms of which these people died. So if they died by virtue of the fact that they were blown up by the Israeli Apache helicopter gunships, then that's a significant addition to the mounting evidence that Israeli forces actually went on this panicked rampage, and they started firing wildly with their powerful weapons, and they killed both Palestinian fighters and indeed the Israeli civilians that were there. If you look at the testimonies of the survivors at the kibbutz, there was a lady, Yasmin, I think Yasmin Porat. She mentioned that she saw the helicopters which had these large amounts of these cannon shells and these Hellfire missiles, and the pilots weren't able to make the distinction between the Palestinians and the Israeli civilians at all. They couldn't make the distinction who's a soldier, who's a civilian. So as when we hear reports of one of the squadron leaders telling the people that, look, shoot everything, they basically shoot at everything. So this idea of the civilian death toll being so high because Hamas is using civilians as human shields, or that they use them on the 7th of October, it's debunked by their own official narrative that is coming out. So the question at the end of the day is who benefits. The other point is, which I've also sent you the article on the New York Times report, we are given to understand that as early as a year before the incident, Israel apparently had the full details about what transpired on the 7th of October in terms of the plan, which they called Operation Jericho. If you again check the New York Times was the first article to basically blow this up into full exposure in terms of what transpired. And then, of course, Electronic Intifada recovered that particular article. But they basically made the point that Israel knew in advance a year ago what basically happened, or what was going to happen, or what the plan was going to basically take place on that particular day to the letter. Now, the point is that it's quite clearly that they would have got this specific information via some form of intelligence in terms of what transpired, or somebody would have informed them. But it's quite clear that they knew the information, they knew the end game, and they did nothing about it. So was this possibly a false flag operation? Was this something that Israel needed? Because it provided a convenient excuse for Israel to engage in its particular acts of sanguinary warfare and mass genocide. And the point people basically are asking is that, is it possible that this could have been a false flag operation? Would they have done this? Because, I mean, there's other false flag operations that have happened in the past, like the Lavon affair. Check up what the Lavon affair is in relation to that. Check up what happened prior to the incident. Check up why is it that at the given moment when you can't come to the fence entering Israel, how is it that on that particular day all these fighters were managed to get inside Israel? What happened? How did the Israeli soldiers stand down? So all these questions are not being asked, are not being looked at. And so the general propaganda is what happened on October 7th. I'm also saying, let's not even go back, because a lot of our Muslim brothers, and I see some of the interviews, when they questioned about October 7th, they say, well, we need to go back to the history, 75 years. And sometimes you lose by default, because why go back 75 years? Why not just go back 2 days before October 7th? 2 days before October 7th, Israel launched a pogrom, a massacre in the Huwara village in West Bank, where they killed 6 Palestinians. Prior to that, this year alone, hundreds of settlers invaded Al-Aqsa Mosque. All those actions are illegal under international law. In this year alone, 2023, look at the count in terms of how many Palestinians were killed before the October 7th. This year alone, between 2022 to 2023, how many Palestinians were killed, either by raids, either being killed on the West Bank by the Israeli settlers and the Israeli Defense Force? How many Palestinians were killed? More than 200, close to 300. Look at the figures. So look at what happened over the past 2 years before October 7th, and then you juxtapose it with what happened to October 7th. October 7th, which they are putting forth as the total, the worst massacre that has ever been committed since the Second World War as a result of the Nazi Germany's Holocaust. That's now basically blown up into smithereens. But it's too late. It's too late, because they've already massacred 21,000. It was convenient for them to engage in what they did. and they needed the beheaded babies. They needed the burnt Israeli civilians. They needed the rape, because that would create the sympathy, it would garner global support, and that would give them an ideal leverage and indeed a convenient weapon of mass distraction to commit its atrocious conduct in terms of what is going on at this particular juncture.
You know, what I find quite disturbing is that, unfortunately, to the Western media and to the media overall, that numbers, it's just numbers. You know, when people, Palestinians are being killed and massacred, it's a number. It's no name, no person, personal information is shared about the, individual. And one thing I realized, especially when you mentioned like Talk TV and Piers Morgan, that every time they use the term Hamas, barbaric. It's barbaric. So they're trying to label the Muslims who are trying to defend themselves as barbaric individuals. And people fall for that terminology because it's a mindset. As soon as you mention Hamas, it's barbaric or barbaric.
Absolutely.
You know.
I made one point, Brother Muhammad, about the numbers and the figures. It's quite strange that you made the point. Gideon Levi, who is the journalist for Haaretz, when he was interviewed by Sky News, he made the point that Israeli civilians, if they were to see, because they are getting numbers and they're getting statistics, but if they were to see on their national television what a lot of us in the West are seeing in South Africa, in the UK, I mean, they've got no access to Al Jazeera, that's shut down, so that's totally out of the question. But if they were to see what Israel is doing now, they would basically take up against Israel. I mean, already you've got a dissatisfaction amongst these individual civilians who've had their families taken as hostages. They've protested directly against Netanyahu. And one of the points they're making is that if you are so concerned about the lives of the hostages, how do you justify the indiscriminate, or could we rather say targeted bombings, where you don't know where the civilian hostages are kept? Your own hostages you don't know, and you don't really care. I mean, this was borne out just 3 weeks ago when those three men, they were in their undergarments, they took off their shirts, they walked with a white flag, and they spoke in Hebrew, and Israel shot them dead. What was the response? Oh, it was a mistake. So they're running out of excuses. It was a mistake. But the mistake that they made was that they possibly, if there was a mistake, which I doubt, but if they believed it was really a mistake, the only mistake could have been that they assumed that these were Palestinians. Because if these were Palestinians, and it's realized that these were Palestinians, they would basically say they were being attacked. And these were Hamas militants that had been attacked, and so they shot them. Like they've done at the school. I don't know if you should show it. It's not advisable to show it. But when I showed it on my YouTube channel, the killing at the Abu Ghazala school, where you have pictures on Al Jazeera, shown live pictures of actual dead bodies lying, strewn around, lying, and eyewitness testimonies that are saying there was no bombing or striking of the school. These are children and people and civilians that were taking refuge in the school being shot dead in cold blood. And you can see the eyewitness testimony, and you can see the dead bodies. They're not burnt as a result of a strike. These were shot dead. So Israel is now engaging in systematically targeted shooting and murder of Palestinians. These are death squads. I mean, like the situation where they bulldozed the dead bodies that were killed, or they are basically destroying the graveyards. We just see these reports daily. Why do you destroy a graveyard? Why do you uproot the entire graveyard? Are there Hamas tunnels there? So the lies are being broken down by the minute. It's becoming so disingenuous that that basically there's no justification, and the people are being brainwashed. I mean, I don't know if the brother can play this video clip which I've sent of the Israeli children singing. Have you seen that song, which was produced by the Rosenbaum Communication? Have you brothers seen that particular song?
Yeah, we have seen it.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
so it may not be necessary to play that, but here you have a situation where children are basically egging on the Israeli Defense Force to totally destroy Gaza, and they use the term "destroy to oblivion." in a year there will be no one there, and we will be able to return to our fields and plow our fields. Your fields in Gaza, what are you talking about? So this is a problem that you've got before you, and unfortunately a lot of the discussions that I've seen in the mainstream media, I mean, sometimes, and I mean, the brothers are excellent, they're articulate, but unfortunately, a lot of the discussion, a lengthy portion of the discussions that you see, the presenters take you back to October 7th, and then you have to go through a lengthy discussion, and you witness an obfuscation in terms of what is going on before your very eyes, in terms of what is transpiring, what is happening. And therefore, the agenda is to take you away. It's to take you away from actually what's transpiring. So October 7th is a convenient excuse in relation to that. And we know the fact that Hamas is just simply the smokescreen. That's a smokescreen. So when they ask you about the Hamas charter, most of them don't know what it contains. They don't know what it contains, but that's basically thrown before our very eyes.
It's that, that's where I was going to ask you next regarding the charter. Every time you have these so-called shows, Piers Morgan and other individuals who are paid by media organizations who are somehow connected and linked to this type of Zionism, thought process. They always first question, of course, Brother Yusuf, is asked, "Do you condemn Hamas?" Okay. Let's get that cleared first. Then it's the charter. The charter clearly says that we need to wipe out the Jewish state, this land. Please give the audience some understanding regarding this. And also, I want to touch on the hasbara, Israeli propaganda machine, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one point. Firstly, Hamas, prior to its formation in 1987, was a movement that was a benevolent movement, and that was basically involved in charity. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. I saw a discussion some years back by Mahdi Hassan, which was apparently refuted by Dr. Azam Tamimi, where Mahdi Hassan stated that Hamas was in fact created or funded at its earlier stages via Israeli intelligence as a kind of a bulwark to the far more militant back then Palestinian, the Fatah, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as it was known, because both the PLO and the other movements like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is run by George Habash, or back then was run by George Habash, that was a Marxist organization. Islamic Jihad never existed, and there was no Islamic movement as such that was basically engaged in any kind of resistance. So the talk is, and again, this has been questioned, I don't know how people view it, that apparently Israel wanted a kind of a more nuanced, religious kind of alternative to Fatah, which would be less inclined to engage in any kind of resistance. I mean, and the argument that is put forth is a kind of similar kind of argument that is made in the kind of the Afghan context, where they basically put the argument that the Mujahideen were al-Mujahideen, the Taliban and the forerunners to them in the 80s, were basically backed and funded by the CIA and via the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence and so on. So the same kind of argument is made in relation to Hamas. And I've seen this by some journalists. I believe there's a book I have here. I think this book here, Jeremy Scahill. I think get this book here if I've got it here. Jeremy Scahill he's got a book called British writer, Dirty Wars, the World is a Battlefield. And I think the same kind of argument is put forth. But a lot of other scholars like Dr. Azam Tamimi stated that is not correct, that Hamas, in fact, grew as a legitimate alternative Islamic resistance to what they saw was oppression during the First Intifada. And so I don't want to get involved in that particular debate. But now it comes to the issue about the Hamas Charter. Firstly, the one point that needs to be noted about this is that the Hamas Charter, the original Hamas Charter, if you can, those who access it and can in fact read it in Arabic, it's not part, if you look at the official constitution and in fact the official documentation of Hamas as it stands today, the original Hamas Charter of 87 doesn't play any part of it. Two of the Hamas leaders, one was the well-known individual called Khalid Mishal, the other one was Abu Musa Mazruq, made the point that when it was drafted in haste. So there is no talk about any kind of extermination of Jews as such. And they make the point, Hamas makes a point in relation to the Charter of 87, that when there's any kind of reference to Zionists or the Zionist state, the word that they use in Arabic is Yahud, Yahudi, or Yahud. Now, in the absence, and this is again subject to correction and my ignorance, but in the absence of a terminology or a term for Zionist in the classical sense, in the Arabic parlance for Zionist, they use the term Yahud. But Yahud in the context of not Jews in general, but Jews specifically with an ideological bent towards Zionism and indeed sustaining the state of Israel through its oppression and its sanguinary warfare against Israel. So that's the first point that they make, that the reference to Yahud in the original Hamas charter is in reference to the Zionists. The second point is this, is that the only reference to extermination, if at all, and in relation to Israel, which is not, there is no direct imperative, but there is a mention, which we're all familiar with, about the hadith of the end times, this kind of eschatological reference in terms of which, where come the end times, even the stones and the trees will, in a manner of speaking, make mention of the fact that there is a Jew behind me, get him, get him. So when they talk about extermination, they use and they refer to this particular reference in the original Hamas charter, which is in fact hadith. Now, of course, and I know Brother Nazam, and I don't know if he's listening to this podcast, he's well aware that there are different categories of hadith, but be that as it may, whether it's authentic or not, non-authentic, the point being made is that hadith on its own is a hadith which details the end times, something which is eschatological, something which is not a direct imperative to kill. And one may add this other point as well, that you find the same thing about extermination of Jews in Christianity. And when I tell some of my Christian brethren, I was having a chat with a Christian pastor the other day, I said that this kind of so-called hadith, which is contained in the Hamas charter, which you people basically have so much of an issue with, well, you find something similar to that in the end times in your own biblical tradition. I mean, if you look, for example, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, when Jesus comes in the end time, and he will come with a rod of iron, and in fact, if I may just basically get the reference in relation to what Jesus will basically do, is that he will basically come. I saw heaven opened. His clothes, that Jesus, was a vesture dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God, Jesus. And out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and the wrath of the Almighty God. And the remnant was slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. Now, if you get a concordance, if you get a Bible concordance to the book of Revelation, and all those passages about Jesus killing and Jesus slaying, you get a cross-reference which takes you back to the Gospel of Luke chapter 19, verse 27, where Jesus says, of those enemies of mine who would not let me reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me, as a kind of a metaphorical allusion to the end times. Now, who were his enemies? The enemies were his immediate contemporaries, the Israelites, the Jews. He was referencing the Jews. So when he comes, with the exception of the 144,000, he will be slaying all his enemies, all the Jews. They will be all put to the sword, and they will be slaughtered, and they will be massacred. So similar to that, you've got something analogous to that in the Hadith corpus, which gives this idea, and I don't have the Hadith in front of me, that in the end times, even the stones and the trees will be making this so-called proclamation that there is a Jew behind me, get him, get him. So that's what's basically contained in that original Hamas charter. And so when there is a criticism on the Hamas charter, people don't actually know what the criticism is. They assume that this is basically calling for the destruction for the state of Israel, or the fact that this is essentially anti-Semitic. And this is basically invoked by a lot of the critics of the particular movement of Hamas as proof of its failure or inflexibility of recognizing Israel. But the charter is a historical document. It has to be viewed in a particular historical context, which was the context of 1987 and the time of the First Intifada, where there was no military might challenging Israel. The Palestinians were fighting against his tankers with stones and sticks and their own human bodies. But that charter, which people don't tell you, they allude to the 87 charter, that was updated in 2006. When the updated charter came out in 2006, Hamas, in fact, accepted that they would basically accept a Palestinian state. Hamas stated in the 2006 charter that they would accept the Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, but without recognizing Israel, because they believe it's illegitimate. And there's no problem with that. Why should you recognize a state that is founded on the base of illegitimacy? I may add the other point, which the brothers may not know. The ANC government, we are ruled by the ANC government. And there's a lot you probably hear about the corruption and untold corruption within government, particularly during the Zuma administration itself and so on. But the ANC government was a liberation movement. It came up with the Freedom Charter in the 50s. In its charter before the Freedom Charter, the pre-Freedom Charter, I should have emailed you that document, the document before the pre-Freedom Charter. That basic document of the ANC excluded whites, it excluded coloreds, and it excluded Indians from joining the ANC organization, the ANC Liberation Movement. Now, of course, whites, coloreds, and Indians eventually did join the ANC in the 60s and the 70s and so on during the height of its struggle. But at its earliest stage, it was a black supremacist organization. Now, Hamas's political vision has also evolved, one must look at it. Initially, at its earlier stages, you could probably stereotype it as a kind of a Jew-hating movement. But at this particular juncture, or particularly at the point when it won its superficial elections, it clearly showed its indication of evolving. The other point is this, is that Hamas, in its own accord, initially, prior to 2006, it refused to participate in any form of elections in the political process itself. By conceding, after the failure of the Oslo Accords, that look, it's willing to participate in the elections in 2005 and 2006, which it won successfully, it offered evidence that it would be willing to function in a modern state and under a democratic system. The other point is this, is that the document, which is known as a Hamas Charter of 87, was long done away with, because if you look at the 2017 Hamas document, which it cites as its own document, because people, when they talk about the Hamas Charter, they're talking about the Hamas Charter of 87, which Hamas and the Hamas leadership has also rejected. The 2017 Hamas document lays down its particular principles in a 42-page document. And what its goal is simply to liberate Palestine from the Zionist project. It certainly has a frame of reference to Islam, and it certainly, because it's indeed an Islamic movement, but there's no reference at any level to the extent that it's going to destroy the people of Israel or destroy the Israeli people. I mean, certainly it's accepted in 2006 that it's willing, if Hamas has accepted that it's willing to accept a Palestinian state on 1967 borders in 2006, how can that now be viewed as somewhat destructive? In fact, the 1967 borders acceptance is a concession. It was also a concession by the Palestinian Authority, the PLO. The PLO initially always spoke about a single state. In 1975, and I was not around in 1975, I don't know if any of the brothers were around. In 1975, that's close to how many years? We're almost in 2025, close to 50 years ago, close to 50 years ago, the PLO made a concession that it's willing to accept a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. That was a concession. And from 1975 right up until 2023, we've always been given to let down the alleyway that, look, Israel has always made these concessions and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas has not. But Hamas has accepted the 1967 borders in 2006. The PLO, before the existence of Hamas, accepted the 1975 borders, the 1967 borders, way back in 1975. So what are we talking about here? This is basically a game. It is a false charade that is being put before our eyes, and that is basically being put as a kind of a wool to deflect us from the real issue. And this is the whole point, where Israel always portrays itself as the victim, and it portrays those around it as its basic oppressors. I mean, Bassam Yusuf, and I'm not going to repeat the words that he used, but he made the telling point that Israel is like an abusive spouse in a relationship. It basically, in his own words, F's you up and then pretends that it's a victim, like a narcissistic psychopath. That's basically what Israel is. So how far more deeper do you want to go in terms of concession? When the movement which you portray as militant and out to destroy you was willing to accept the 1967 borders, recognize it in its updated 2006 charter in 2006, how can you claim it's out to destroy you? This is a hypocrisy that we basically see. And so I would urge brothers, and if you can put up the PDF, I will try and send a copy of the PDF of this particular book, Why Israel. There's a number. These books are foundational. Why I say they are foundational, there are other good books out there, but why they are foundational is because for the layman out there who doesn't want to wade into detailed information by the likes of Noam Chomsky, or they find some of the material by Ilan Pape and Noor Masalha or Norman Finkelstein a bit complex, this would be the straightforward material to give the core issues on the point, and I'll be happy to share that information out with you on that point. So I think that's basically the aspect on the issue of Hamas, and I think that should just put the whole situation to bed. The charter the people condemn is the 87 charter, which Hamas itself has updated, evolved from the 2006 charter, and the 87 charter doesn't even appear on any official documentation of Hamas at all. And even if it were to appear, at the very best, it's a reference to a particular hadith speaking about the end times. It's got nothing to do with it being a direct imperative calling for the destruction or the killing or the massacre of every single Israeli out there. I didn't get your next question, brother.
Yeah, before we go to the next question, I just want to remind everybody that please continue to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and it really helps spreading the dawah and spreading our mission and our goals. So guys, don't forget to hit that subscribe icon. And there's so much still to kind of discuss, to be honest. You touched on slightly onto the point of propaganda and how the Israeli propaganda, I do feel that it's swaying against them right now. And the hasbara, I think the term is hasbara. That terminology, if you don't mind briefly talking about that.
Yeah. Perhaps just before Brother Yusuf elaborates on that point, I just want to essentially collaborate on the point where Brother Yusuf made mention of how the church will also essentially towards the end times look to subdue the church of the synagogue. So we have it here in Revelation chapter 3 verse 9, where apparently Christ is speaking, although this is just a nominal understanding. It's actually what is commonly understood. The book of Revelation is understood to be the dreams or the visions of one of the apostles, John, which is not really clear who this individual is, whether it's John of Zebedee or John the Elder or John the Apostle. There's uncertainty as to whoever wrote it. But however, the passage in itself clearly states in Revelation chapter 3 verse 9, I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars, and I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. So here we see a little indication that these very Zionists, make mention, who pretend to be Jews, but are in fact secularists to the extreme, allowing things such as gay pride parades. It's far from being a Jewish state based upon the religiosity of the Torah. So here we see those who pretend to be Jews. These are the people who will even fall down before Christ. They will be as the church of as the Satan.
Even before that, Brother Mustafa, if you go to chapter 2, verses 18, where the angel of the church, these things said the Son of God, chapter 2, verse 18, who had his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass, in reference to Christ. And then going on to verse 22, behold, I will cast her into bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulations, except they repent with their deeds. And I will kill her children with death. And all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the rein and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. Now, of course, there's many interpretations on this particular chapter, and certainly some would view it as a metaphorical allusion. But just for a second, imagine that Hamas included all these references from the book of Revelation in his charter in terms of what Jesus would purportedly do in the end times on his second coming, with a sword sticking out of his mouth and bringing fire and brimstone and judgment on the people. Would they say the same in relation to the Hamas charter? So it's a hypocrisy that you see clearly. The reference there was totally religious, and they used that chapter, and it's quite clear that in the context it's referring to Zionism and the Zionist ideology, and not Jewish people per se. I mean, I spoke to Rabbi Weiss.
Yeah, this is a fundamental.
Just one point. I spoke to Rabbi Weiss, Yisrael David Weiss from the Netzorah Karta. I did an interview with him about 4 or 5 weeks ago. They met with Hamas officials themselves, Jews, met with them. They went to Iran. I've even seen the pictures. He didn't show them on the screen, but they've met with them. So it's quite clearly that this, when someone like Douglas Murray says that, look, the hatred and the protest for Israel is as a result of Jew hatred. This should fall on deaf ears, because essentially it's not got nothing to do with Jew hatred. It's your anti-Semitic guilt of European society that you wish to superimpose on the Muslim people and on the Palestinians. I mean, Jews and Muslims historically never had any problem with each other. Anti-Semitism is a European construct. Hatred towards Jews is a European phenomenon. It's a European construct, not a Muslim construct. So this is the whole point where these lies get called out in the longer scheme of things. Yeah, absolutely. That's a fundamental point that the brother has observed. So we must bear in mind that we must distinguish between being anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish. There's no such understanding of Islamic parables which suggests in any way, shape, or form there is anti-Jewish sentiment. So this is something we need to be absolutely clear on. Otherwise, Muslims would not be allowed to marry Jewish women. In what religion is supposed to be anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish when it allows Muslim men to only marry women, which also includes Jewish women? So hence you have that anomaly which has been set aside. Yeah, of course. I mean, Muslims, we are allowed to marry people of the book, Jews and Christians believing people of the book. So, I mean, if you're anti-Jewish, does it make sense? Which by its definition, it's like an oxymoron. Anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic means hatred. How would you marry someone you hate? Meaning you marry a Jewish woman or a Christian woman, you hate it. It doesn't make sense. So it's like a kind of the ultimate oxymoron in relation to that. But coming back to the brother's point on the question of the hasbara, hasbara is a Jewish word. It's a Hebrew word, and it basically, if I could, it basically in reference to what I would say a kind of a brand image. So it's a hasbara is in loose terms a reference to the sophisticated public relations machinery that is set up to shape the media coverage of the atrocities that are being committed by Israel. And this basically is, the aim of the propaganda is to obviously create this kind of obfuscation. So they obscure true meaning. You can take the form of oversimplifying. You oversimplifying by saying, look, you are dealing with monsters and rapists. This is the terminology that is being used by Mark Regev and Elon Levi, at least two of the individuals that I see quite clearly. Or it could take the form of outright lying, where, for example, they deny the bombing of the hospital, and they pointed out and they twisted it, even though one of their own ministers tweeted that there was a Hamas operative and so they targeted, but they denied it because of the fact that there was this media outrage. And so they changed it to say that, look, it was Islamic Jihad that was involved in the bombing of the hospital. So that's a question of clearly outright lying. Or they dissemble, or they create this kind of obfuscation in the minds where people don't know what the real situation is. So, where you got someone like Ben Shapiro, the whole aim of his particular programming, or his, it's not even good to mention some of these names, but they want to brainwash human minds to think in a particular manner and to basically impose certain kind of illusions. And for years, they've had the media to back them up. And when I talk the media, I'm saying the Israeli hasbara propaganda, which is its own kind of sophisticated public relations machinery, had the support of all Western mainstream media, meaning they had the support of the BBC, they had the support of CNN, they had the support of ABC, all the major news networks in the world, in the Western world that is, played a fundamental, pivotal role in creating a system that is supportive of this propaganda function. So the justifications are chosen people, promised land, the idea of the Exodus, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and more particularly the Holocaust. The Holocaust is always cited. The Holocaust is always cited. So come October 7th, this is the worst massacre ever perpetrated by the Holocaust. Nonsense. What nonsense? Now the reality of the figures are far much lower, because if you take into account that the 420 or 500 were civilians, were soldiers, that means the balance of 600 were civilians. So it's only about 600 killed. Are you telling me that out of the 600 killed by Israel, by so-called Hamas, and they tried to create an analogy that, look, this is the equivalent of 3 times what happened on 9/11, where 3,000 Americans were killed on 9/11. They are trying to draw the moral equivalence that 3,000 were killed on 9/11, 3,000 Americans. The killing of these people on the 7th of October is equivalent to 3 times of that, which means 30 to 40,000, which is a massive massacre. Well, if that is the case, what then is the equivalent of the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza? If 21,000 is equivalent to 1% of the population, then what is 1% of the population in the United States? Do the maths, do the calculations. Astronomically huge figures. So this hasbara is this propaganda. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. The Holocaust, they are always portraying themselves as victims, but this is falling aside. This is basically falling by the wayside, because in reality, what you see is a kind of a psychological projection. It's like a kind of a theory where these people are attempting to defend themselves against their own impulses, against their own evil, by denying their existence whilst attributing it to others. So they engage in the genocide, they engage in the mass murder, they engage in the beheading of people and the burning alive of children and families and hospitals, which is clearly genocide and clearly ethnic cleansing. But they state, like, look, genocide has been committed on us. You can't make this up. It's like Orwellian in nature, double speak. You know what this guy Winston Smith in 1984. It's like double speak. So, for example, they tell you that they are always concerned and caring about the Palestinians. They made an open pathway for them to move south, but the Palestinians move south, and then what happens? They bomb them in the south of Gaza and they kill them in Gaza. Then when you question them on that, they said, no, we have created another area where Hamas is not. That area is a wasteland to accommodate 2 million people. So these lies are being fallen apart. I'll give you one classic example. In South Africa, in 2011, just after the Operation Cast Lead of 2009, the former Israeli ambassador to South Africa Baruch, his name was Baruch, I think Ilan Baruch, he resigned from the Foreign Service. He resigned completely. He had about 30 years of spin doctrine. And if you look at his letter of resignation, he made a telling point in the letter, which is available to be viewed. Just type in Ilan Baruch resignation letter, former Israeli ambassador to South Africa. In his letter, he stated that he's no longer willing to represent Israel because the government of Netanyahu has no interest in the peace process, and he finds himself in a state of disingenuity to continue basically providing a simplistic defense and a superficial defense of Israel. He also made the telling warning that Israel should take note that the way in which apartheid South Africa eventually destroyed itself and self-destructed and disbanded was basically what will one day happen to Israel. And I can tell you quite clearly, you can see that there is a kind of a paradigm shift. There's a change. There's a change now where even the so-called two-state solution, I know some people are still calling for the two-state solution. Nobody now is talking about two-state solution. We need only one solution, the total and utter disbandment of apartheid state of Israel. Total disbandment. That's what we need to call for, total disbandment. All the members of the Knesset, including Netanyahu or the criminal thugs that are running the Israeli Knesset and the Israeli administration, need to either face the Hague or, worst case, the guillotine. And if you have a situation where Gaza and the West Bank is in a sense amalgamated, now you no longer have the Gaza, you don't have the West Bank, and you don't have the apartheid state of Israel, but you have got one entire country with Israelis and Arabs living side to side. And of course, the Israeli population is going to be increasing, and that's what they fear. Sorry, the Arab population is increasing. That's what Israel is terrified of. That's why they want to get rid of them, and they want Egypt to absorb them, and they want the Jordanians to absorb the West Bank. They are terrified that with the Israeli Arabs, with the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, with the Palestinians from the West Bank, there's going to come a time where the proportionality of Jews versus Palestinians are going to basically long outweigh them by a margin in terms of the population. And when that basically happens, you're going to have a new state. You're going to have a totally new state. You're going to have the equivalence, at the very least, of of what happened under the apartheid South Africa, which was also sustained, which was also an apartheid state, which was sustained through all forms of unjust laws and all forms of inequality, and that collapsed. And let me tell you something, whilst apartheid South Africa was a polecat of the world, our own Minister of Intelligence, once upon a time, Ronnie Kasrils, made the point that apartheid South Africa at its height was nowhere near apartheid Israel at its height. Nowhere near. We had people and black people in townships and the Bantustans. We never had helicopter gunships bombing and destroying townships and blowing them into smithereens. We certainly had skirmishes. We had massacres that took place. We never had anything close to the massacres and the ongoing systematic genocide that was basically being perpetrated and unleashed in brutal form on the Palestinians. None of that. We still had a good infrastructure. Apartheid South Africa was evil. It was there was a level of inequality, but blacks still had education. Indians had education. I grew up partly as a child under the apartheid regime, but we educated ourselves. We never had tanks coming in or whites going into the townships and taking over people's houses and places. Certainly there was displacement, but there was the economic apartheid. The apartheid continued at an economic level, but it was nowhere close to what you see in Israel today over the past 75 years. Not an iota, and this has been recognized even by some of the leaders in South Africa. I mean, F.W. de Klerk, the last white president, when he was speaking at the Oxford Union and was questioned, and in a subsequent interview, I think he was questioned on Hard Talk by Stephen Sakur, or was it Christian Amanpour, and he was questioned was how did he justify apartheid? And you know what his response was? His response was, when Israel does it, and when Israel does worse things than what we did at the height of apartheid, why do you never criticize Israel? And so I think it was Christian Amanpour was silent. Check the interview. I think it was Christian Amanpour, F.W. de Klerk interview on South Africa. That interview where he questioned on that, the hypocrisy, the double standards, the duplicity. It's because of the fact that the hasbara is so powerful that the Israelis have embedded themselves in almost all the major news outlets of the world, in the entertainment industry. I mean, look at the major entertainment industries of the world. You look at the big five. Warner Brothers was Jewish. Metro Goldwyn and Mayer, if they still exist, Jewish. Walt Disney, Disney himself, I believe, was Jewish. Walter Elias Disney, that was his name. If you look at some of the CEOs and the forerunners at Universal Studios, all the major entertainment industry, all the major news conglomerates and the news outfits, all were run by Jews, but particularly those with a specific ideological Zionist bent. And therefore you found it's been so easy to sustain the narrative over the decades that Israel is a victim and those around them are basically the terrorists and the monsters, and they're this benign, benevolent state that is perpetually under some sort of constant siege. When it's the other way around, they project on others, like the psychopathic husband on his wife, blames his wife for his own narcissistic behavior. That's basically what Israel does. I think we need to shout it from the rooftops, and certainly social media has exploded in recent years, and the alternative media has basically shown the hogwash that this kind of false narrative has basically gone down the sewage, as we clearly see in present times, when people can no longer justify genocide, except those without any kind of morality or moral qualms.
On those latter points that Brother Yusuf has just made, it's just analogous to the points that I've been making on these shows on a regular basis over the course of the 2 years. The fact that the media industry as well, the entertainment industry, which has been cited, Warner Brothers and other such organizations which came prevalent in the early part of the 20th century, this was in essence a systematic attempt to demoral society in general. That was the basis of when pictures, visual pictures became prevalent for the first time, in which women were, for the first time in history, exposing their bodily parts. And this wasn't very prevalent upon how the Warner Brothers set about a new moral structure in which they were going to liberalize society as the generations continued. And hence we see, as made mention, that essentially Israel is a secular state. There is no religiosity within the actual construct of the governance. Although we do have politically minded Jews, we still are at the position whereby the secularists, they decide everything within the system. So this is actually a state which, rather paradoxically, as Christians believe that the Jews must be in Zion in the precipice of the coming of Jesus. This is a fundamental point which Brother Yusuf may be interested in elaborating on.
Yeah, so I think on that point the support comes from the Christian right, and indeed the Christian far right, particularly in the United States. And so you've got these tours that are being basically conducted by them and to the Middle East, and they believe in this kind of mad, insane idea that whatever is going to happen is going to lead to this kind of potential Armageddon, which will herald the second coming of Christ. And so you've got this kind of support. And I'm even surprised that I was going to do a debate, by the way, a couple of weeks ago with Michael Brown, who describes himself, although it's fake, but he describes himself as a Messianic Jew, although what that means is also quite problematic. We were going to set up a debate on that particular issue of the present situation in Israel and Palestine and Gaza, and certainly we were going to look at some of the historical and religious element behind it as well. And at the last minute, he canceled the debate, and the reason for the canceling of the debate was because of the fact that I had made a Facebook post, and on my Facebook, because that's where I've been getting the information out to a wide array of people, I had alluded to the idea that those Christians basically who support the state of Israel hypocritically and duplicitously have no shame or qualm when their own particular Christian co-religionists have basically under siege. And I think the allusion there was to the Reverend, I think the famous video which you may have seen, I think Reverend Munter Isaac, he gave that famous Christmas Day message from Bethlehem, where he clearly lambasted Israel. And even before that, leading up or after the 7th of October, I made an allusion to that. And at the last minute, he canceled it. So the point I'm trying to say is that there is no solid intellectual or moral case that you can make to support this genocidal state. And unfortunately, sometimes those of us who are caught up in the media or call for interviews get caught up in that particular dictum and get placed, unfortunately, on the back foot. And so you then have to always justify and explain yourself. But intellectually, morally, and religiously, there's no particular basis for it. There's an interesting book. It just came out. I don't know if you brothers have ever seen, speaking about at least one of our mentors, Sheikh Ahmed Didat. He wrote a book. I don't know if it's available in the UK, but it's a phenomenal book called Arabs and Israel, War or Peace. This was written during the first Intifada. I found this book by chance when I was, over the past few weeks, I was reading a bit again on, since the conflict started, and I came across this by chance after I'd put this away in my library for some time. But he makes an interesting argument in this particular book, in the sense that even from a religious point of view, the so-called claim of Genesis chapter 16, verse 7, I will give unto thee, and thy seed after thee, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Even that cannot be religiously justified. Even from that perspective, cannot. And he goes into a lengthy discourse and discussion on that particular issue. So I'm saying religiously, intellectually, morally, socially, spiritually, Israel collapses on all four legs, cannot sustain itself, absolutely nothing. But they've got powerful spin doctors. They've got spin doctors who have a way with words. It's the height of irony. It's a double speak that every single Israeli school book today teaches a racist discourse that quite literally wipes Palestine off the map. Maps in the school books only show the Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, from the river to the sea. Palestinians are mentioned in stereotypical racist icons, classified as refugees, primitive farmers, or terrorists. And the reality of the situation is that despite that position, that reality, it's always the other way around. So you're always confronted. I saw some of your really impressive marches in London where people are questioning, what do you mean by from the river to the sea? Well, it's Israel. The terminology from the river to the sea is actually originally a terminology that was used by the Likud party, that they called for the Eretz Israel, the greater Israel. They use that terminology. They never question on that. It's always a Palestinian, pro-Palestinian supporters. About Israel, Palestine being wiped off the map, you always have propagandist narratives about Hamas teaching Palestinians about how bad Jews are and inculcating hatred for Jews. The Palestinian curriculum doesn't inculcate hatred for the Jews. It's the other way around. And yet in the mainstream media, you get this presentation that Israel preaches harmony. Israel preaches benevolence. Israel is a victim. And the Palestinians and the Arabs are basically involved in hatred towards Jews because it's a sole Jewish state in this whole, siege of Arab hate and hostility. You couldn't make this up. It's doublespeak and it's Orwellian. This is a classic. If you're looking at George Orwell's 1984, Israel is a classic Orwellian state. That's what you got before your very eyes in practical real time before our eyes.
Yeah, if you don't mind me just interjecting there, Brother Mustafa, we've come to the 2-hour mark, and I've got 2 more questions before we get to some of the questions from the audience. Sometimes when you hear these so-called interviews and taking place on these major platforms, I think George Galloway is doing a fantastic job. He's been doing a job in that type of field for such a long time, and he has been highlighting some of the double standards and hypocrisy of the Western government. And sometimes you have people like Piers Morgan trying to justify the bombing and what's taking place, the civilian loss in Gaza to Germany, and how the British and Winston Churchill bombed certain cities in Germany and killed, civilians just to nullify the Nazis and so forth. And also in Japan, that the Hiroshima and much more bombs were dropped on to kill out and submit the concept of that. And also, there's a link to this. Do you feel that the same situation what's happening in Ukraine right now? Do you think NATO and all these governments have they kind of like shunned Ukraine now? Do you think the same thing will take place from the Western governments in Israel? Do you think they will be like slowly, unofficially swept under the carpet, and their support for Israel will subside and reduce? Do you think that will play a part in the future?
It's difficult to say. What I can say is that firstly, with regards to Ukraine and Israel, I mean, Piers Morgan, by the way, was one of the first people to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, and he called it a war crime. He called Putin a monster. By the way, the Ukraine war was 2 years, right? From I think February 2022 right up until now, ongoing. More people have been killed, more children have been killed, more women and civilian men have been massacred in 7 weeks in Gaza than have been killed over 2 years in Ukraine. This is the gravity of the situation that we are basically dealing with. So I think it's a hypocrisy where you find, for example, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, crying crocodile tears, talking about war crimes when it comes to Ukraine, when Russia did not even close to the kind of atrocious carpet bombing that is being done to Gaza, where Gaza is being, I don't encourage people to see, but I've seen one of these programs called the Walking Dead, kind of a zombie apocalypse. That's basically what you see there, like literal zombie apocalypse, where dogs are eating the dead bodies and the dead remains of Palestinian children being butchered because the families can't come and take them out and bury them because the IDF will shoot them dead, or they can't move out of the hospital because they may be shot dead, or can't walk out of a church. So the 2 ladies were shot dead outside a church. It's horrific. You cannot make this up in real time. So you see a hypocrisy. I don't think that the Israeli issue will be swept by the wayside, because it's been in the kind of the public domain on and off for decades. So it's been an issue, and nothing basically inflames passions like any other conflict in the world, more so than, for example, even the invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq, than the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So you've got 3 claims there. You've got, for example, the earliest history of Christianity in that particular region. You've got the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the masjid, that's a kind of our spiritual, if I want to call it, kind of allegiance to that kind of entire region. And of course, you've got the Israeli so-called religious claim to it, albeit that it is justified on the basis of Zionism, which appropriates religious terms and terminologies for it. So I don't think it'll be swept by the wayside or kind of forgotten in the sense that you see what's happening in Ukraine. Although the fact is that you see so much of killing, so much of slaughter, so much of massacre, that there may come a time, and certainly there has come a time, where Western media will certainly, there'll be an ebb and flow, and certainly due to the fact that there's a desensitization process. Oh, there are people just dying. What else can we do? We can't do anything. That may possibly happen. However, this needs to be kept in the public domain, and I think Israel is on its part of self-destruction. Netanyahu has to complete this. He has to continue with this massacres and the genocide, because if he doesn't, that'll be the end of his career. So he's fighting for his survival. But there will come a time that Israel will have to stop. And they know that when they stop, they will have lost. They will have lost, firstly, the propaganda war, because of the fact that the people now see in plain sight what Israel's all about, in terms of it being a killing state, a terrorist state. Secondly, his own community will be fed up with him because of the fact that they haven't succeeded in getting all the hostages back. And third, they would not have succeeded in defeating Hamas. Rather, if you make the argument that they're out to target Hamas, they're actually empowering Hamas. They actually are empowering Hamas. So that's the position. With regards to the analogy, I saw this analogy about the bombing of Dresden, and why the analogy is so disgusting and such a disgrace. Well, firstly, the bombing of Dresden can never be justified. It was killing of civilians. That's a given. But be that as it may, the bombing of Dresden is not even analogous to what is happening, because the bombing of Dresden took place after the Third Reich emerged, and Nazi Germany was on its mad quest. It was a state. It was on its way to becoming an empire, and it had killed approximately 12 million people at the time of the bombing of Dresden. The bombing of Dresden basically resulted in approximately, I think, 25,000 Germans being killed, which is bad enough. But contrast 25,000 Germans being killed with the 12 million that were killed by the Nazi regime. Now apply that to Israel. How the hell does Piers Morgan apply that to what is happening in Gaza? Because in Gaza, what we now realize that at best 600 Israelis were killed, at best. The others were civilians, and then others we don't know who were killed by helicopter gunships. In contrast, and you juxtapose that with 21,000 Palestinian men, women, and children, civilians being killed. So where is the analogy? Where is the analogy to Nazi? Where is the analogy to Dresden? I just don't see the analogy. I don't see. In fact, the contrary position is there, that Israel is more analogous to the Nazi regime as opposed to the other way around. So there's this moral equivalence that he wants to draw. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The Dresden argument is a stupid argument. It's a useless argument. It's a poor argument. It's a bad argument. And unfortunately, I see there was one interview where one of our brothers, Andalusi, for example, tried to show how even the bombing of Dresden was immoral. And I think it was Mohammed Ijab who made the point that the bombing of Dresden was a terrorist act. But that's not the point. The point is that the analogy which Piers Morgan and some of these people are raising, like Douglas Murray, is so fundamentally flawed at an essential level that you can't even make the analogy. You can't make the analogy of killing 12,000 people vis-a-vis 12 million that were incinerated by the Nazi regime. You can't compare Hamas, which is a loose, ineffective organization that is just simply limited to guerrilla warfare, that has got no army, that has got no military might of the caliber of Israel or even what Nazi Germany had. You can't even make that analogy. So it's a bad analogy in relation to the points that are being made. But the one point I want to make this, and I hope this goes through. I do criminal law. And the argument that is being put, and I know that times that we're going to move for Maghreb now, but I just want to make this point. There is an argument that Israel is making that it doesn't intend to target civilians. Now look at the argument. When they bombed the Jabalia refugee camp, they were going after one Hamas, but they killed 50 people. But their argument is they don't have the direct intention of killing Palestinians. Palestinians are collateral damage. Now, in terms of criminal law, when you look at the dolus, which is the doctrine of intention, there is a doctrine of intention. Intention can take three forms. One is dolus directus, meaning direct intention, dolus indirectus, indirect intention, dolus eventualis, or dolus indeterminatus. All of that is direct, it fulfills the definition of intention. So, for example, when you look at a doctrine called dolus eventualis, if I kill somebody, where a person commits a crime with the intention in the form of dolus eventualis, if the commission of the crime, that is a murder, the unlawful act, or the causing of the unlawful result, is not the main aim, but he subjectively foresees the possibility that in striving to his main aim, he will commit the unlawful act, and he nevertheless commits the unlawful act in such a situation, in South African law and in terms of criminal law internationally, you can be convicted of the crime of murder. That is dolus eventualis. So apply that argument to Israel. What is the aim of Israel? What is the commission of Israel? The commission of Israel is the commission of the aim of Israel is to target Hamas. But in doing so, if the main aim is not to kill civilians or to murder civilians, but do they subjectively foresee the possibility that in striving towards the main aim, albeit getting rid of Hamas, they will kill civilians, then according to that particular principle, their acts are in fact unlawful. This is unlawful, totally unlawful. So this is the particular point that you've got to have. Have I lost the brothers here?
No, we're here.
Are you still there? I think I've lost. Are you brothers there? Because I think
Mustafa's going to pray Maghrib. I'm here.
Well, sorry. Our Maghrib is basically in about 20 minutes, so I've got some time. So basically, the point I was just before I went off. So the point I was trying to emphasize is that argument falls because number one, Israel doesn't just foresee the possibility that in striving towards its so-called main aim, i.e. targeting Hamas, it's going to kill civilians. It knows full well. So when it bombs the refugee camps, does it know it's going to kill civilians? Does it foresee the possibility or does it know? It knows full well. It doesn't foresee the possibility. It knows that it's going to kill civilians and it nevertheless kills them. That is a war crime. That is your intention to murder. And if you want to call that that's not direct intention, well, then it's indirect intention. It's dolus eventualis. And in terms of dolus eventualis, it is the intention to kill. And you can, on an individualistic level, be basically convicted of murder on an individualistic level. Now apply that to Israel and apply that tenfold to Israel on that particular aspect. The second point is this, and I just want to end with this, is that Israel cannot make the claim of defending itself. Under Article 51, and the brothers need to know this, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, it only allows a member state to defend itself against another member state. An occupier which is occupying territory, can never claim to defend itself against occupied and oppressed people under international law. You take people's houses and lands, you randomly kill them up at times, you lock up small children in jail, and if they fight back, you massacre the whole lot of them. You can't claim self-defense. You cannot claim self-defense. What Israel is doing, so when people ask the question, does Israel have the right to defend itself? The answer is no. Israel has no right to defend itself. The question you're asking is premised on a wrong moral quandary that you have to find out, because it is only defending its white settler colonial project, which is imposing apartheid laws for the past 75 years. I mean, before 7th October, I made this point earlier, that in the West Bank, Israeli settlers torched and burned down 3 Palestinian towns on the West Bank this year alone, with the full support of the IDF. Ramzi Baroud, the well-known Palestinian activist Ramzi Baroud, pointed out that last year there was systematic gang rape and sexual abuse of Palestinian women by Israeli soldiers and Israeli settlers on the West Bank. So, what are we talking about? It's been killing people in droves. And I think one of your da'is in the UK made the point that if someone is being raped and the rapist, the person who is being raped, fights back and kills the rapist, are you going to go and ask the person, do you condemn the murder? Do you condemn the murder? So the rape victim is killing the rapist, but the rapist has been raping this rape victim for years and repeatedly, and gang raping this woman. And the only question you ask this victim is that, do you condemn the killing of this rapist? Do you condemn the killing of the rapist? That is basically what they are. They are defending the rapist. So are we so foolish to raise these particular issues? What happened on 7th of October, whatever the case is, could be a false flag operation, could be Israel killing its own civilians. But if it was Hamas, was a kind of a response to a 15-year siege of a concentration camp and decades of killing of Palestinians. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't buy that argument. at all, because Hamas, in fact, the spokespeople for Hamas made the point when they didn't support the so-called rapes that were brought to their attention, which they claim apparently happened. They made the point that as an official policy, Hamas and Palestinian resistance groups do not target civilians. If civilians were targeted, of course, from an Islamic point of view, we would condemn it. But they made the point in their public official document, and even Mohammed Daif, who's the head of the Izzuddin al-Qassam brigades, made the point that this was in direct response to the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque this year, and Israel, in fact, killing and wounding Palestinians this year. And even the Huwara massacre, check up the Huwara massacre on the West Bank, 3 days before the October 7th. Nobody would have known about it had October 7th not happened. So he's saying that the reality is that civilians are killed, were being killed, was happening before October 7th, is happening now. And October 7th is just simply the green light to engage in massacre that you've never seen, at least in recent modern times.
I think one aspect we also be looking at the possibility. I mean, people in mainstream media, there's also counter-conspiratorial suggestions that in some capacity Hamas is acted as a wing of the IDF as well, knowing the exact response that the IDF would do in relation to the events of 7th of October. And, there's a very famous YouTube videos of Benjamin Netanyahu exclaiming that they will need to use Hamas for the purpose of making sure there is no two-state solution and, diverting the other political path. So what are your views upon that?
Well, look, I've seen those, I did a program for Loving Life TV where those same clips were basically played out. In fact, it's not just here. Even the Times of Israel, the Haaretz papers, and so on, have made the point that for a number of years, Benjamin Netanyahu basically took this kind of approach that divided power between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And what the argument is, I don't think it is as conspiratorial as some people want to make it out to seem, but it is convenient for Hamas to be there in the Gaza Strip, because Israel was in fact tacitly or implicitly in fact supporting Hamas. They were giving them the food, the shelter, the electricity. The funds were going directly to Hamas, and the point being made is that Netanyahu basically, Hamas was also included in discussions about increasing the number of work permits that Israel granted to Gazan laborers, the laborers that moved there to Gazans. And so Israel was actively involved in the negotiation with Hamas on those particular issues. And with the negotiations with Hamas, there were about, I think, 3,000 to 4,000 permits that were issued to Gazans that were working in Israel. And this was done through negotiations and communications with Hamas. So what the point is that the argument that is made that Hamas is necessary to be there because it is prescribed as a terrorist outfit in different parts of the world. And secondly, the existence of Hamas will ensure that Gaza remains fully under siege. So if Hamas, for example, is prescribed internationally as a terrorist outfit, Israel maintains the point that, look, they are being faced with a perpetual existential threat, which is Hamas. There is this schizophrenic relationship that they have. And it suits Israel to have Hamas there because having Hamas would ensure that an independent Palestinian state will never basically exist. If you look at the past decade, most of the time, Israeli policy, rightly or wrongly, was to treat the Palestinian Authority as a kind of a burden. And one can talk about the corruption in the PA. And the idea was to treat Hamas as a kind of an asset. Netanyahu made this point clearly. He was quoted as saying, I think there was a meeting in 2019 or 2020, that those who oppose a Palestinian state, a legitimate Palestinian state, which Israel opposes and has never allowed, should support the transfer of funds to Gaza, because maintaining that separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So it suited them. You've got PA in West Bank, you've got Hamas in Gaza, small strip of 40 kilometers long and I think 6.5 kilometers wide. Two different factions that are in principle not ideologically the same, that are opposed to each other. And the fact that you don't have now a single unitary, solitary leadership for the Palestinians will ensure that Hamas is sustained, the PA is on the other side, and the Palestinian state will be non-existent. So this is the whole point. And bolstered by that policy, Hamas, to a large extent, in fact, did grow stronger and stronger by the day. And funds did go to Hamas from the state of Israel. So whether, I wouldn't say that Hamas as such was working as a kind of a front for the IDF, as some right-wing conspiracy theorists would like us to believe. But I'm saying that there was a nexus and there was a schizophrenic relationship where kind of Israel, it's a classic program of rule and divide. The classic program of rule and divide. Once you divide people, it becomes far more easier to control them. And then you've got other factions. You've got the Islamic Jihad organization that's there. It is a different faction. I don't know. I think you may also have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine there. So these are the factors, and so there might be some point in that. Yes, brother.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, I think Brother Mustafa was discussing something else with somebody else. I had to mute him. Brother Mustafa, I do apologize. I think there was some sound coming from yourself. But subhanAllah, we have to really wrap it up. Brother Ismail, Yusuf, we really appreciate your time, your efforts, and hopefully we can continue with this, mashallah. Oh, Brother Mustafa, one second. Brother Yusuf, we just lost the connection. But while I was saying, brothers and sisters, that has been a very interesting stream. It really has been very beneficial. Brother Mustafa, I had to mute you. Sorry, brother. There was some background noise, so apologize.
I apologize. Sorry.
It's not a problem. Brother Yusuf, I think, just lost connection. But I was just trying to wrap the show up because I have to play Maghrib, and of course, here, Brother Yusuf's back now. Alhamdulillah. Bringing you on now, Brother Yusuf.
Yeah, I seem to have got cut off for some reason. Sorry about that, brothers.
No problem.
We will be breaking for Maghrib shortly in South Africa, but it's been, I think, great chatting with you brothers here. I really appreciate the time. I think it's important that we create this discourse at the very least, Dua is one thing, and I see that there are some brothers that don't even support the idea of protests or boycotts for that particular matter, which is tragic in the United Kingdom. But I think we need to create this awareness. We need to create the awareness in the public mind in terms of what is really happening. Create this discourse and ensure that the average mind, the layman, gets to know what we're dealing with, that we're dealing with this monstrous entity. And eventually, it will basically play a role in terms of influencing public policy decision-making. In the UK, in Scotland, I mean, you've got a Muslim prime minister in Scotland that has got family that's in Gaza itself, and of course you've got Ireland, the Irish, the party of Sinn Féin, and I've seen some of their pronouncements on the issues. So it shouldn't be long. I mean, you almost had one. You had Jeremy Corbyn at one point, who could have probably been the prime minister. Just unfortunately,
I actually interviewed him, Brother Yusuf, on a channel. Yeah, about 4 or 5 weeks ago. I asked him about the Zionist plot to actually get rid of him. He was very reluctant to speak about that, as if fearful that if he makes a comment as such, he would be, get in further trouble, because essentially we all know that he was the one who was going to become prime minister, but they threw out the anti-Semitic card against him due to his support for the Palestinian people and due to his general decency. And we saw how their media roller coaster machine got into full motion, and they castigated him as being an anti-Semite, and before you knew it, he was given a good thrashing in the general election. So the way they work is tremendous, and I do suggest, this is my quick point, I'll wrap up, Brother Muhammad needs to wrap the show up, which is, I do suggest you look at a particular British politician here, which you may or may not be too familiar with. His name is Michael Gove. I've spoken relentlessly about him on Brother Muhammad's show. I believe he's amongst the most influential world politicians over the last post Second World War. He has formulated much of the current chaos which is developing in this country. For example, the absolute change of universal morality, the advent of LGBTQ education for young children at even primary school level here in the UK. He's the real major protagonist of everything that we see today, which has been turned upside down. And he's an open Zionist. Yeah, he's an open Zionist as well. He appears on different shows to explain his Zionism. Adopted as a child. And I think that's something you should investigate. I've got some excellent information on him. And perhaps when we're off stream, I can perhaps just share that with you.
Has he not run to be leader of the Conservative Party? Did he not
That's the esoteric nature of this individual. He's the one who actually decides who becomes prime minister. He's the one who sets policies. There's a very interesting YouTube video of a particular Labour politician who makes this point. There are only a select group of people who actually formulate policies. They decide who becomes prime minister, for how long they serve, what policies they have, and anything in which conflicts with that, they'll just do away with it. He's like
I think Cameron appointed him as shadow minister at some point, or shadow.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's right. He was.
I haven't studied too much on this guy, but
no, please do. It's absolutely vital that I believe that you do so. Correct. He was appointed actually education minister in 2005 as well. Yeah. And also, out of interest, he was the individual who got rid of Suella Braverman, which I will speak to you at some other stage about. And he appointed, out of interest, full 18 years later, David Cameron as the Foreign Secretary.
Wow. Because
there's an interesting YouTube caption of actually him the weekend prior to the sacking of Suella Braverman, that he was seen dressed in a suit near to Victoria Station, which is I'm sure you're familiar with, in central London, not too far from Parliament. He was dressed up in a suit, and he was actually caught by some brothers who were filming him, who were saying, "Is that not Michael Gove?" So he made the decision on a Saturday afternoon, having attended an emergency meeting with another one of his cohorts by the name of Douglas Smith, who was also a very shadowy figure who decides all the governmental policies here in the UK. And before you know it, within 48 hours, Suella Braverman was sacked. So there are certain things which I've just given a slight elaboration, but it's very worth you investigating this particular chap and what he's all about as well. He's the real catalyst of, I believe, the events that are even occurring today in Palestine.
I certainly will look at that. I'll certainly look into that, inshallah.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa. This is a big topic to unpack, and inshallah ta'ala, hopefully we can continue maybe next week, or we can invite Brother Yusuf on again and continue with this topic or another topic of his choosing. But brothers and sisters, don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also, like I mentioned at the start of the stream, that Brother Yusuf is from South Africa, and he is part of the South African Debate Initiative, which I think Sabine Ahmed, if I'm not...
It's a fledgling channel which I formed. Basically, after I left the IPC, I kind of created it's a non-profit entity that is basically there to gear to host and have programs. We've been having these, I don't know, Brother Nazim may have shared, we've been having these kind of tag team debates, myself, Dr. Shabir Ali, and with some local brothers, Reverend Samuel Green in Australia. So we've used that as a platform for debate and discussions. It's a fledgling YouTube channel, but we hope to get some kind of traction. And of course, I'll definitely, hopefully, download this content and share it with my viewers there, inshallah.
Yeah, barakallah. Thank you.
Certainly subscribe. I would certainly, tell the brothers to support your channel, and you guys are doing phenomenal work. And I would urge members to, donate, become a member, support this channel, grow it, and of course with some of the other brothers that are doing sterling work in getting this information out there, because this is what we need in the public. And certainly this is somewhat. I want to visit South Africa and some of the sharks. Well, there's lots of shark nets, but we've had one of the largest shark attacks over the decades on the KwaZulu-Natal coast of Durban, I think globally, but that's under control now. We've got other problems. We've got other sharks that we are dealing with in the South African context.
Yeah, Brother Gambit is mashallah, a member to the channel and a regular viewer, and always comes out with interesting statements. But inshallah, maybe we will visit South
Just
Africa
very
together.
Mohammed, just very light brief. I mean, something which I wanted to very brief, no more than 20 seconds. We're quite, Brother Yusuf, quite fortunate to be living in South Africa, where the government is actually supporting the cause of the Palestinians, unlike perhaps any other non-Muslim government in the world. So we here in the UK, we're curtailed in much of what we can say. As you're aware, we can't even make slogans on the protest, such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." The narrative being that this is causing, inciting the extinguishment of the state of Israel. So even crazy type of statements coming from the government sources directly to the authorities to stop even such slogans really shows that we are curtailed in mass in supposed freedom of expression countries.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's our great advantage. I may just share this, I didn't have the time, but it's quick, that South Africa has now brought an application in terms of the Genocide Convention, and it's taken, I haven't had the time to discuss it, but it's a lengthy 75-page document where they've basically approached the International Court of Justice, calling for declaration that what Israel is committing is genocide, asking for an immediate ceasefire. I may add this point that it's the irony, because apartheid South Africa was one of the strongest allies of apartheid Israel, apartheid South Africa. But post-94 South Africa is certainly one of the strongest critics, and I think I can credit them as much as I criticize the ANC government on other domestically related issues. I think one can't fault them with the position they've taken. There was a parliament ruling that was passed, a resolution that was passed in parliament shutting down the Israeli embassy in South Africa, in Pretoria, although that has not yet been practically exemplified yet. It is there in principle. And we still do have a strong Zionist presence in this country, because in Cape Town, in other places, and certainly the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, has been traditionally supported by Jews. So you've got a strong Jewish presence that control the economy here. But from a practical principle point of view, South Africa has basically come out quite strongly against the state of Israel, and has taken this up to the International Court of Justice, which should deliberate on this particular issue shortly. And this is one of the few times that the Genocide Convention was invoked, and certainly a declaration would be made. It's not the International Criminal Court, it's the International Court of Justice. It has other rules and other regulations. Israel has in the past, as they do generally, rejected some of these resolutions, and but once a resolution is passed and a declaration is made, certainly its particular credibility in the public eye will fall into abeyance as the days go by.
Alhamdulillah. So, just a final question for you, Brother Yusuf. You got a YouTube channel?
Yeah, the YouTube channel is I had my own private YouTube channel, which is kind of gone, but the YouTube channel which we use is called the South African Debate Initiative. So if you go on YouTube and just simply type in South African Debate Initiative, it'll click up the YouTube channel, and that basically has a series of a few programs we did. So it's a fairly new YouTube platform. I think it was formed sometime last year, and it's got about, I think, 48 to 50 videos. How it started off after I left the IPCR, the Islam Propagation Center. I had been with a channel in South Africa called ITV, Islamic TV channel, and we had a session in 2021 on the aspect of Islamophobia, and we had a number of leading figures that I interacted with, one of whom was from your own country, Adnan Rashid. Brother Adnan Rashid and I are quite close with each other, amongst others. And we then decided to upload the material on YouTube. So this channel was created for that purpose. And so any programs that we do on that and other related issues, political, religious, or otherwise, are there. And we're still growing, and those can basically subscribe to the channel, share it with others. And we certainly have some, upcoming programs. I was planning to have Professor Rashid Khalidi on the program recently, but he's been inundated with requests for discussions. Rashid Khalidi is the professor at Columbia University, the author of the 100-Year History of Palestine. I urge all the viewers to get a copy of that book, or at best I could email you the set. I may just add one thing, and I need to thank this brother. There's a brother from the United Kingdom. I think he was I don't know him. I've never spoken to him. But he's a library of resource material. His name is Brother Shafayat Chowdhury. I don't know if you know him, but he was put in contact with me by Brother Nazam. I don't know the circumstances or the details in terms of how he got in contact with me, but for years now, close to a decade, he's been sending both myself and Dr. Shabir Ali any material that I want. So, for example, I ask him, can you get me the entire list of Robert Spencer's books on PDF? He has it and he sends it to me. Can I get me all the books of Noam Chomsky on PDF? He sends it to me. So I think I need to take credit on this station to thank the brother. I don't know who the brother is. I don't know what he does, but certainly he's been an excellent resource guide. I think Brother Nazam knows him. I'm not so sure if Brother Muhammad or Mustafa knows him. His name is Shafayat Chowdhury, and he's an excellent resource material that has been giving stuff and material and thesis and academic treatises over the years that I've really appreciated and really made good use of it. So I want to take this opportunity on this platform to thank the brother there. If he's listening, I salute the brother, and I'll certainly more than likely share the information with you, and you could probably put up some of the books and materials that you wish on your channel. If you want to put up the Genocide Convention, the application that's been done by South Africa, I'll send you a PDF link and you could upload that just below your channel, and people could download the document and see what it entails and contains.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. Like again, it's nice to end on a positive note. There are some brothers and sisters behind the scenes who helped me with this channel. Of course, Sister Dawa, who helped me with the thumbnail, which Yusuf was impressed by. MashaAllah. And also Brother Dawood, the servant of Allah, who was backstage helping sharing.
Thank you, Brother Dawood. Jazakallah.
And our brother Mustafa, thank you, Brother Mustafa, for helping out and joining us and co-hosting the show. And finally, I'd like to thank Brother Yusuf Ismail taking time out for this, and hopefully we can continue our relationship and continue to spread the information. And then, of course, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for making this all possible, that we are all linked and brothers in Islam and working together for the sake of Islam. And thank you to the audience also for contributing. We had a poll in the chat where people have voted, and overwhelmingly 77 plus people feel that Hamas is winning the war and will win the war in Gaza. I actually think on that same idea that I can't see the IDF winning at all. I really can't see them. And this is another topic that we can unpack, inshallah, in the future and hopefully talk through it. Brother Mustafa, any final words from you before we end the show?
No, I'd just like to thank you for giving me another opportunity to co-host this very interesting show, which was very eruditely and expertly decoded by Brother Yusuf. It just gives an undertaking, and I would strongly suggest the audience do watch the show again to take in and grasp all the points, so that you can also confidently assert the narrative when you speak to your non-Muslim, particularly acquaintances or friends or work colleagues, with the view of then presenting the reality of the situation which is happening in Palestine, and really get the narrative out, because essentially that's all we can do as people. We can't physically stop anything. We're curtailed. We feel the pain of our brothers and sisters who are suffering in Palestine, the situation which has been going on for so many years, and the enemy seems to be in control of so many matters. But we know the final control lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have a commitment and a passion to forward on these very important events which are taking place in history. And obviously we're doing this solely for the sake of Allah. And I do, as I said, would reiterate for the people who have enjoyed listening to the stream to watch it again and to get the information at hand, and then to present it to the people who are your non-Muslim friends and colleagues. So that would be
absolutely, Brother Mustafa. Absolutely, Mustafa. Final words from me, guys, is that don't think that somehow the battle is being lost. Overwhelmingly, we see people taking the shahada due to what's happening in Gaza. They see the impact of the Muslims and how they are positive even in this conflict. People, the brothers and sisters in Gaza, they're thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't give up hope in Islam. They continue to practice their religion, and this is having a huge impact on Islam. And Brother Mustafa recently has been taking shahadas of people who have been seeing the conflict and then accepting Islam. So that's really amazing. And thank you, Brother Yusuf, for your time and your support. And of course, feel free yourself to use the footage from this channel for your channel and spreading the message. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, and Allah reward both of you brothers and the brothers in the background and the sister, and may you basically increase spiritually from one level to the next, inshallah, and may Allah shower His blessings and mercy on our brothers and sisters in Gaza at this point in time. Jazakallah khair.
Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.